There are moments that split a life in two, the before and the wreckage after. For Seraphina Vale Virelli, that moment came on a Tuesday night in March, inside a ballroom full of men who had pledged their lives to her husband's name, when she watched him reach up and unclasp the one thing she had never touched, never asked for, and never wanted the Virelli Crest and place it around another woman's throat. The room went completely still, and then every man in it turned toward her, not toward Alara Sloane, who stood there, glittering with borrowed triumph, not toward Maddox Virelli, who had just committed what would later be understood as the single most catastrophic miscalculation of his 43-year life. Toward Seraphina, she didn't flinch. She didn't move. She let the silence do what silence always does in rooms full of dangerous men. She let it breathe and fill and harden into something none of them would soon forget. Then she said very quietly, "You gave her a symbol. You never gave her the power. If you've ever loved someone who refused to see your worth until it was almost too late, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next? Inside, the Virelli family will change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the woman every man underestimates until she's the only one left standing. The Virelli compound sat on 40 acres of protected land outside the city, ringed by a stone wall that had been standing since before Maddox's father was born. The ballroom was in the east wing, high ceilings, dark wood paneling, chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. It was the room where the family gathered for the things that mattered: funerals, succession announcements, and the quarterly meetings where the captains reported and the Don presided. It was not, by any tradition Seraphina had ever witnessed, a room for theater. But Maddox had always had a weakness for theater when he was trying to prove something. She had known something was wrong 3 hours before the meeting started. Not because of anything she'd been told. Nobody told Seraphina anything directly anymore. That had been Corvin Drax's quiet achievement over the past 2 years, cutting her out of the information flow so gradually that the people around her barely noticed it was happening. Cancelled briefing here, a redirected call there, Maddox mentioning something at dinner that she had clearly not been included in, then covering it with a distracted apology that neither of them believed. She had noticed. She always noticed. She had simply chosen to let it run, because cutting a wire too early ruins the whole map. What she'd picked up on that particular Tuesday was the energy in the compound, the way the household staff was moving faster than usual, avoiding eye contact, and the way 2 of Maddox's outer guards had been repositioned to the east entrance rather than their standard posts. Small things, wrong things, the kind of wrong that comes right before someone does something they can't take back. She dressed carefully. She wore charcoal, not black. Black was for mourning, and she refused to perform grief she hadn't earned yet. She wore her hair the way she'd worn it since the first year of her marriage, pulled back simply, no jewelry, except her plain gold band. No performance, no armor that looked like armor. She walked into that ballroom knowing something was coming. She just didn't know Maddox would make it quite so public. He was already standing at the front of the room when she arrived, flanked by Corvin on his left and 2 junior captains on his right. Alara Sloane was positioned slightly behind him and to the side, close enough to be seen, carefully staged to look like an afterthought. Seraphina clocked the positioning in about 4 seconds and understood exactly what it meant. She took a seat at the far end of the table, between old Fennec Rourke, who had served Maddox's father for 30 years, and who gave her a small, tight nod, and Dario Cassen, who was 32 and brilliant, and who looked, for just a moment, like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. Maddox began the meeting with the standard reports, quarterly numbers, territory status, a brief mention of a negotiation on the Eastern Freight Corridor that had apparently concluded favorably. His voice was steady, and commanding whatever else he was, Maddox Virelli knew how to hold a room. He had the kind of presence that made other men want to defer to him, even when they privately thought he was wrong. Seraphina had spent 15 years watching that presence work. She knew every note of it, and she could hear, underneath the performance, that he was nervous, That was new. Maddox didn't get nervous. He got cold. He got calculating. He got the particular kind of very still that meant someone was about to have a very bad week. But nervous, that tremor at the base of a voice that most people would miss entirely, that she had not heard from him in a long, long time. She didn't let herself look at Corvin. Not yet. She looked at the table, at her hands, at the mild, attentive expression she had spent years perfecting, the expression that said, "I am simply the wife. I am simply here. I am not the most dangerous person in this room. Please keep talking." And then Maddox stopped talking about freight corridors. He said, "Before we close, there's a matter of succession I want to address." The room changed. It was subtle, a slight shift in posture, a brief recalibration of attention, but Seraphina felt it like a temperature drop. Session was not on the agenda. Fennec Rourke's hand, resting on the table beside her, went perfectly still. Maddox reached up and unclasped the Virelli Crest. It was old, older than the family as it currently existed, passed down through 4 generations of Virellis, and before that through the line it had been cut from, in circumstances that nobody still living could accurately recount. Black iron worked with a seam of actual gold. The Virelli mark stamped into its face a severe, ugly, authoritative thing that had no beauty in it whatsoever, but carried more weight in this world than most legal documents. Seraphina had never worn it, had never been asked to. She watched Maddox hold it in his hands for a moment, and she watched him glance at Corvin just once. Just briefly, kind of check-in that a man does when he needs reassurance that he's still making the right call. And then she watched him turn to Alara Sloane. Alara stepped forward. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, curated, deliberate, designed to be looked at. She was 29, younger than Maddox's oldest child from his first marriage, and she had the particular confidence of someone who had recently been told, very convincingly, that she had won. Maddox placed the crest around her neck. He said, "From tonight, the family recognizes Alara Sloane." And the room, that room full of men who had spent their careers learning when to move and when to hold absolutely still, went completely, profoundly silent. Seraphina counted to 3. Then she watched. One by one, the veterans turn away from Alara and orient themselves toward her. It wasn't a dramatic movement. It wasn't performative. It was the quiet, involuntary adjustment of men who had spent long enough inside a power structure to know, in their bones, where power actually lived. Fennec didn't even turn his head. He simply shifted his weight slightly in his chair. The smallest possible signal. The kind that only mattered to people who knew what it meant. Dario Cassin looked at the table. Maddox looked at his captains. And for the first time, in as long as Seraphina could remember, she watched genuine confusion cross his face. She stood up. She hadn't planned to speak. She had planned to let the silence finish what it was doing. But something in Maddox's expression, not the arrogance, not the performance, something underneath it that looked, for just a second, like a man realizing he was standing on ice that was thinner than he'd thought, made her speak. "You gave her a symbol," she said. "You never gave her the power." Her voice was quiet, completely level. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. Then she picked up her bag, excused herself from the table, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. She made it approximately 40 feet down the corridor before Maddox caught up with her. Seraphina, she stopped walking but didn't turn around. She heard him moving, heard the particular quality of his footsteps that meant he was furious and trying not to show it, and she waited until he was close enough that the conversation wouldn't carry back to the room before she turned. He was not, she noted, wearing the composed expression he'd had in the ballroom. That was gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and more complicated. What was that supposed to mean? He said. Not a question. A demand. It meant exactly what it sounded like. "You embarrassed me in front of." I said 4 words, Maddox. Her voice didn't rise. "You're the one who put on the ceremony." He stepped closer. He was taller than her by several inches, and he had spent 40 years being the largest, most authoritative presence in every room he entered, and she had spent 15 years refusing to be diminished by that particular technique. "Explain to me," he said, low and controlled, "why every man in that room looked at you instead of her. Because they're not stupid. That is not. Because they know something you've apparently been persuaded to forget. She met his eyes directly. Crest is a decoration. It has been for 30 years. The actual authority of this family is not in that medallion. It never was. She watched that land. Watched him process it, reject it, and then reconsider it in some span of about 4 seconds. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. I know exactly what I'm talking about. She paused. The question is whether you want to hear it here, in this corridor, where anyone walking past can listen, or somewhere we can actually have this conversation. He looked at her for a long moment. Maddox Virelli, who had faced down rivals and negotiated with men who'd have had him killed without blinking, looked at his wife of 15 years, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite name. My office, he said. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She wasn't being difficult about the 10 minutes. She genuinely needed them. She needed to walk to the east window at the end of the corridor, look out at the grounds for a moment, and let her hands stop being all quite so tightly controlled. She needed to breathe slowly and remind herself that the next part of this conversation was going to require everything she had, because what she was about to tell Maddox was going to crack something open between them that had been sealed for a long time. And she still wasn't entirely sure what would come out. His office was on the second floor, a large dark room, lined with books he had mostly never read and photographs of people he mostly no longer trusted. She had always found it slightly theatrical, like the room of a man who'd read somewhere that powerful men had rooms like this, and had done his best to replicate the aesthetic. She sat down without waiting to be invited. That was new, too. There had been a time, earlier in the marriage, when she would have waited. She was done waiting. Maddox closed the door and stood near the window, keeping the desk between them. Start talking, he said. The succession agreement, she said. Your father created it 31 years ago, before the family was what it is now, when there were questions about what would happen if the line of authority became complicated. I know about the succession agreement. You know it exists. Do you know what's in it? Silence. Your father didn't trust the Crest alone to hold the family together, she continued. He'd watched what happened to other organizations when the symbol of leadership could transferred without the infrastructure behind it. He was smarter than that. He created a secondary document, a sealed binding agreement that specifies the actual terms of family authority, who controls the accounts, who holds the signatory power, who the senior captains are legally bound to recognize in matters of, let's call them, extraordinary circumstances. Maddox's jaw had tightened, and he appointed a guardian for it. She held his gaze. Someone he trusted to hold it until it was needed. Someone who had access to the family's affairs, but no personal stake in the throne. Who? Me, Maddox. The silence this time was different. Your father gave it to me in the 3rd year of our marriage, she said. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that you were brilliant but vain, that you had your mother's temper and his ambition, and that he'd watched too many men destroy their own empires because they couldn't distinguish between the woman who flattered them and the woman who would hold the whole thing together when everything went sideways. Maddox moved away from the window. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hands flat on the desk. You are telling me, he said, that for 15 years you have been sitting on a document that overrides my authority, that supplements it, that creates a check on it, that ensures this family can't be destabilized by a single bad decision from a single person, no matter who that person is. She didn't break eye contact. Your father understood something you've been working very hard not to. What? That power without continuity is just violence waiting to happen. He stayed very still for a moment. Then he said very quietly, is this about Alara? This is about Corvin. And there it was, the thing she'd been waiting to say. She watched it hit him, watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rapid reassembly of information. The moment when a man who is genuinely intelligent starts to put together architecture of something he's been standing inside without seeing. Corvin, he repeated. 3 things have happened in the last 18 months that you attributed to external pressures, to market shifts, to the normal friction of running what you run. She kept her voice flat, informational. 2 of your most senior captains, Belav and Tarn, pulled back from their positions in the southern corridor and redirected their operations through channels you didn't authorize. You were told it was a logistics dispute. It wasn't. He said nothing. 7 accounts that your family has held for over a decade have had their signatory access quietly duplicated, not changed, duplicated, so that someone else can move money through them without triggering your notification systems. You were told the discrepancy was a banking audit error. It wasn't. Still nothing. And Alara Sloan, she said, was introduced to you 14 months ago through a contact that Corvin sourced, recommended, and personally vouched for. A woman with the right background, the right presentation, and a particular talent for making powerful men feel that the people trying to protect them are actually the ones holding them back. Maddox straightened up from the desk. You're telling me Corvin recruited her. I'm telling you Corvin built her, found her, prepared her, positioned her, and pointed her directly at you. Seraphina reached into the bag she'd set on the chair beside her and removed a flat envelope, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a plain manila envelope of the kind that contains documents. I have been putting this together for 9 months. I didn't move earlier because I needed it to be complete. Incomplete evidence doesn't stop men. Like Corvin, it just makes them more careful. Maddox looked at the envelope. He didn't take it. She understood why. Taking it meant acknowledging that he needed it. Meant acknowledging that the version of the last 14 months he'd been living inside was not the actual version of events. Meant acknowledging at some deep level that he had been managed and maneuvered and expertly played by the person he trusted most in the room. What was his end goal, Maddox said. Tonight was his end goal, or the beginning of it. She set the envelope on the desk between them. You publicly transferring the crest, the visible symbol of Virelli authority, to a woman he controls. On record. In front of every captain. That's not theater, Maddox. That's a legal moment. A precedent. That's him building a case in front of witnesses that you willingly surrendered your authority and designated someone else as your successor. She paused. His successor in practice. The silence stretched. He's been building toward this for 2 years, she said. Slowly cutting me out of your information network. Slowly feeding you a version of this family where I was ornamental and unreliable. Slowly turning the outer ring of captains toward his direction. Slowly ensuring that when the moment came, you'd do exactly what you did tonight publicly, in front of witnesses, without fully understanding what you were actually doing. Maddox walked to the window again. She watched his reflection in the dark glass, the set of his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. He was a man recalculating an enormous amount very quickly, and she knew him well enough to know that part of what he was recalculating was that he had been wrong. Not just tactically wrong, not just momentarily wrong, comprehensively, structurally, intimately wrong. That was hard for him. It was hard for anyone, but for Maddox, it had a particular weight, because he had built his entire self on the premise that he saw clearly, that he read rooms and people and situations with a precision that other men lacked. Whatever else he might not be, he was not the kind of man who got played. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. It was the first honest question he'd asked her in a long time. Because you wouldn't have believed me, she said. Not 9 months ago, not 6. He'd been working on your perception of me for 2 years. If I'd come to you with this earlier, before the evidence was complete, and before tonight showed you exactly how far Corvin was willing to go, you'd have dismissed it. Maybe worse. She let that sit. I needed you to see it yourself. I needed tonight to happen. He turned from the window. You let it happen. I let the performance happen. Part that couldn't actually hurt us because I had already made sure it couldn't. She met his eyes. What that document doesn't do, what Corvin apparently does not know it does, is render the ceremony tonight legally meaningless. Crest is ceremonial. The captains know what they pledged to, and it wasn't a piece of metal. He crossed the room again. This time he stopped in front of her, close, and she watched him look at her, really look at her. She thought, for the first time in possibly years. Counts, he said. The captains, he turned. Belav has been playing both sides. He's manageable. Tarn is more compromised, but not beyond retrieval. She picked up the envelope and held it out to him again. It's all in here. The financial trail, the communications, the recruitment records for Alara, the names of every person Corvin has been quietly cultivating in your organization for the past 2 years. He took it this time. He held it without opening it. Alara, he said. The word had a different texture now. She's not your enemy. She was a vehicle. Seraphina's voice didn't soften, exactly, but it didn't sharpen either. She's in a position she wasn't fully briefed on, making moves she was told were safe, serving a plan she doesn't entirely understand. That doesn't make her innocent, but it makes her a different category of problem than Corvin. And Corvin is going to figure out very quickly, if he hasn't already, that tonight didn't land the way he expected. The captains didn't fall in line behind the crest. They looked at me instead. She stood up, straightening her jacket. He's going to move. I don't know when, but it'll be soon, and it'll be harder than tonight. Maddox looked down at the envelope in his hands. You've been protecting this family, he said. Not a question this time. Something slower than a question. I've been protecting what your father built, she said. What you built. What these people have given their loyalty to. She paused. I wasn't doing it for you. I want you to understand that. I was doing it because it was the thing, and because I understood what was at stake better than anyone in this building. That landed differently than she'd intended. She could see it, but it was true, and she'd stopped softening true things to make them easier to receive. She moved toward the door. Don't confront Corvin tonight, she said. Don't change your behavior. Don't adjust anything. Don't let him know that you know. We need 72 hours for what? She opened the door. To make sure that when this ends, she said, it ends completely. She left him standing in his office, holding 9 months of her work, and the ruins of 14 months of comfortable illusion, and she walked down the corridor toward her own rooms, with her hands. Finally unclenched, and she was almost angry enough to let herself feel exactly how much this had cost her. Almost. She stopped at the east window again, looked out at the grounds in the dark. Somewhere out there in the guest house at the property's edge that Maddox had arranged. For Alara's use, a light was on. Seraphina looked at it for a long moment. Not your fault, she said to no one. But not your house either. Then she turned and walked away from the window, and from the ballroom, and from the long, exhausting performance of the evening, and she went to make the first of the calls she'd been waiting 9 months to make. Outside the compound was quiet. The captains had dispersed. Corvin Drax had walked to his car with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression of a man who was very good at not showing what he was thinking. He drove away. He didn't look back at the east wing window, where for just a moment a light had been visible. He should have. Seraphina made 3 calls that night. The first was to a woman named Iris Fenn, who had been the Virelli family's private accountant for 11 years, and who had 14 months ago quietly begun keeping a second set of records after noticing that certain transactions didn't add up in ways that honest transactions don't add up. Iris picked up on the second ring. Seraphina said, "It's moving. Be ready." Iris said, "I've been ready." That was the entire call. The second was to Fennec Rourke, who answered in the gravel and patience voice of a man who had expected this call for some time. Seraphina told him they had 72 hours. Fennec said he would need to make 2 calls of his own, and that she should know Dario Casson had come to him after the meeting with questions. She said she knew. She said to tell Dario to sit still and trust the timeline. Fennec said he would, in the tone of a man who wasn't entirely sure a 32-year-old with a talent for thinking fast could be trusted to sit still under any circumstances. The third call she didn't make until after midnight, standing at the window of her private sitting room, with the grounds dark and quiet below. That call lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. When it was done, she sat down in the chair by the window and didn't move for a long time. Corvin Drax arrived at his office in the city at 7:45 the next morning, which was 45 minutes earlier than his usual time, a fact that his assistant noted and chose not to comment on. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man who had slept badly and was not going to acknowledge it. He poured his own coffee, which he never did, and stood at the window of his corner office, looking out at a city that was just starting to fill with morning traffic. He ran the previous night's events through his head for perhaps the 40th time. It had not gone as planned. The captain's response, that quiet, collective reorientation towards Seraphina, had not been in his model. He'd accounted for possible resistance from Fennec, who was old-fashioned in his loyalties and hard to move. He'd even accounted for one or two of the middle-tier captains who had personal history with Seraphina from the early years. But the breadth of it, the near-unanimous quality of it, that had surprised him. He didn't like being surprised. He sat down at his desk. He sat down and pulled up the channel he used. For the arrangements, he didn't record through normal channels. There was a message from Belov, sent at 11:40 the previous night, that said simply, things didn't land. How do you want to proceed? Corvin stared at that for a moment. Belov was not supposed to be making that kind of assessment. Belov was supposed to be maintaining his position, staying quiet, and waiting. The fact that he was sending proactive messages at midnight meant he was nervous. And nervous men who were sitting on significant compromising information were a liability he didn't need right now. He typed back, "Nothing changes. Hold your position. Do not contact me again until I reach out." He sent it and then sat back and looked at the ceiling. The fundamental problem, he understood, was Seraphina. She had always been the fundamental problem. He had spent 2 years systematically reducing her influence with Maddox carefully, methodically, through nothing that could be called direct attack, only the steady accumulation of small redirections. Maddox was a man who trusted data, who trusted reports, who trusted the information his most reliable people filtered to him. If the filter changed what came through, without the man noticing the filter had changed, that was not manipulation. That was architecture. He had built that architecture one brick at a time. And last night, standing in the ballroom, watching Maddox place the crest around Alara's neck, he had genuinely believed that the architecture was complete. Then the room had turned. He picked up his personal phone and dialed Alara. She answered after 6 rings, which was 4 more than he preferred. Her voice had a quality that told him she hadn't slept either. "We need to talk," he said. "I was going to call you." "Don't call me. I call you. We've been through this." Pause. "Something's wrong." "What happened after I left?" Another pause longer. He followed her out. Maddox followed Seraphina out of the ballroom right after what she said. They were in his office for over an hour. I don't know what was said. Was anyone else with them? No. Just them. Corvin turned his pen over in his fingers. Twice. 3 times. "Did he come to you last night?" "No." "Has he contacted you this morning?" "No, and she stopped. Say it. He always messages me by 8. Every morning. Been another stop. It's been 9 months. Corvin, set the pen down. Do not reach out to him. Do not initiate contact of any kind. If he contacts you, be normal. Be warm. Do not give him anything to work with. Corvin, what happened last night? Why didn't they? Why didn't anyone acknowledge me? You said. What I said was contingent on certain responses that didn't materialize. That's not an answer. That is the answer you're getting right now." He kept his voice level with some effort. "I need you to hold your position, Alara. I need you to be exactly what you've been. Can you do that?" The pause this time had a different texture. "What am I exactly?" she said. He ended the call. Seraphina had been awake since 5:30. She had slept for 3 hours, which was less than she wanted and more than she expected. She showered, dressed gray today, simple, and was at the desk in her sitting room with coffee and the contents of the manila envelope spread out in organized sections by 6:15. She was going through the financial records for the 3rd time, not because she didn't know them, but because the act of review steadied her when there was a knock at the door. She gathered the papers without hurrying, placed them back in the envelope, put the envelope in the drawer, and said, "Come in." It was Maddox. He had not slept. She could see that immediately, not from drama, not from anything obvious, but from the quality of how he was holding himself, the slight imprecision in his usually rigid posture. He was still dressed in what he'd worn the previous night, jacket gone, collar open, and he had the face of a man who had spent several hours alone with a very uncomfortable truth. He came in without being invited. She noted that, but didn't comment. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without asking. She noted that, too. "I read the file," he said. "All of it?" "All of it." She waited. "Belov," he said. Then he stopped. Then, with visible effort, "Belov has been running parallel on 7 accounts for 11 months. Yes. And Corvin has signatory access to 4 of those. Yes. Under my name." His voice, which had started with some control, Arrived at that last part, stripped down to something raw. Using a power of attorney document I signed 4 years ago for a completely different purpose, and that was apparently never revoked. He had it modified, not forged modified, subtle enough to survive casual review. She kept her voice even. It would have survived any review you'd have ordered, Beats, because you'd have ordered it through Corvin. Maddox stood up. He moved to the window, the same instinct as the night before, the same retreat to the view, and she watched his shoulders work through something. How long have you known about the power of attorney? 7 months. He turned. 7 months. Maddox. 7 months, Seraphina. 7 months of sitting across dinner tables, and what? She kept her voice quiet, which cost her something. What would you have done? If I'd come to you 7 months ago with half the picture and asked you to move against the man who had spent 2 years convincing you I was ornamental, what exactly would that conversation have looked like? His jaw tightened. He knew the answer. She watched him know the answer and hate it. You should have found a way, he said. It was weaker than he meant it to be. I found the right way, she said, which is what I always do. The silence between them had a specific weight. Not hostile, they'd had hostile silences. And this wasn't that. This was the weight of 2 people who had been in the same building for 15 years and had somehow ended up in very different versions of events. What do you need from me for the next 72 hours? He said finally. Normalcy. Nothing changes in how you operate. You have your regular morning call with Corvin at 9, you take it. You are exactly what you always are. Nothing in your behavior tells him that last night registered differently than he expects it to. Maddox looked at her. You want me to sit across from Corvin and act like I want you to do the thing you are extraordinarily good at, she said, which is maintaining a surface that doesn't show what's underneath it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite acknowledgement. Not quite the particular kind of respect that had been absent from their interactions for a long time. Something edging toward it. And Alara, he said. Same. Normal. Seraphina. I know what I'm asking. She stood up. I know exactly what I'm asking. 72 hours, Maddox. Then it ends. But it ends completely, or it ends badly, and those are the only 2 options. He looked at her for a long moment. You said last night you weren't doing this for me. I wasn't. Is that still true? It was a different kind of question than he usually asked. Slower, more exposed. She looked at him. This man she had married at 27 and lived alongside and loved imperfectly and watched systematically diminish her over the course of the last 2 years. Without fully understanding, he was doing it, and she answered him honestly. I don't know yet, she said. He nodded once and left. At 9 o'clock, Maddox took the call from Corvin. She didn't listen and she had access to the line, had always had access to the line, had simply chosen never to use it. But she watched from the corridor window as Maddox walked the east terrace during the call, hands in his pockets, head slightly down, the body language of a man in a routine conversation. When the call ended, he came inside and their eyes met briefly across the hallway. He gave her a small nod. She breathed. Dario Cassin showed up at the compound at 11, which she had expected, because Dario Cassin showed up wherever he felt he was needed about 4 hours before he was invited, which was either a talent or a liability, depending entirely on the situation. He found her in the garden. She was not, in fact, doing anything in the garden. She was standing in it, which was a thing she did when she needed to think somewhere that didn't feel like a room. And he came through the said gate with his jacket over one arm and the carefully neutral expression of someone who had a lot of questions and was trying to figure out which one to lead with. Morning, he said. Dario. He stopped a few feet away, looked at her, then at the garden, then back at her. Phoenix said to sit still. And yet, a brief pause. I'm sitting still in the garden. Very still. He glanced around. Also, I need to tell you something. Tell me. Tarn came to me last night, after the meeting. He said it without preamble, which she appreciated. He said he wanted to know what happened to the room when Maddox put the crest on her, why everyone moved the way they moved. He said he'd seen something like it before, and he wanted to know if it meant what he thought it meant. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, and then I went home and called Fennec, and Fennec told me to sit still. He met her eyes. But I've been thinking about Tarn. He's been different for about 8 months. quieter than he usually is, tending things he wouldn't normally attend. And last night was the first time, in 8 months, he's come to me with a direct question. Seraphina looked at him. What did he seem like? Not what did he say. What did he seem like? Dario considered this. He was young, but he was not careless, and she'd always found that combination worth paying attention to. Scared, he said. Which is Tarn is not a man who scares easily. Whatever he's been involved in, I think he's looking for an exit, and he doesn't know how to find one that isn't also a problem. Where is he now? At his office in the city, as far as I know. She made a decision quickly and committed to it, which was how she made most decisions that mattered. I need you to contact him. Not through any channel Corvin has access to personal, direct. Tell him there's a conversation available if he wants it. Tell him the conversation comes with no conditions and no recording. Dario looked at her. Is that true? It's true enough. She met his look steadily. Tarn is compromised, but not irredeemable. If he's looking for a way out, I'd rather he walk out through a door we control than blow one open through a wall. Dario processed this for a moment. Then he put his jacket back on, buttoned it with the automatic precision of a man who wore suits, the way other men wore second skins, and said, if this works out, I want you to remember I was very still. You were almost still, she said. He left through the side gate. The afternoon brought 2 things Seraphina had not anticipated, which was one more thing than she preferred to be caught unprepared by. The first was a call from Iris Fenn. The first was a covered something who had discovered something in the financial records she hadn't found before, or rather, something that had recently been added to what was already there. An additional access point to one of the Virelli family's primary accounts, created 4 days ago, which meant created 4 days ago in the knowledge that things were about to move. Someone had put a hand on a financial exitador very recently, which meant someone had known the ceremony was happening and had prepared a route out in case it failed. That someone could be Corvin, covering himself, or it could be someone else entirely. Can you trace the access point? Seraphina said. I already did, Iris said. That's the problem. What does it trace to? A pause. A proxy account in Alara Sloane's name. But the creation signature, the metadata underneath it, doesn't match anything from Alara's documented digital behavior. It's too clean. Her real financial footprint is actually fairly messy, normal messy. This is, someone used her name and made it look too careful. Yes. Which meant someone was building a case against Alara. Not Corvin. Corvin needed Alara functional, at least for now. Someone else. Send me what you have, Seraphina said. The second thing she hadn't anticipated arrived in person. 4:15, a car pulled up to the compound secondary gate, not the main entrance. The side access that was technically for deliveries and staff. And the man who stepped out of it was someone Seraphina had not seen in 3 years and had not expected to see at all. His name was Vincent Caro. His name was... He had been Maddox's father's legal counsel for 20 years before he retired, and he was 71 years old and walked with a cane he didn't actually need, which she had always found both characteristic and slightly irritating. The gate guard called her before letting him through. She said, let him in. He found her in the front room, which she'd chosen deliberately for the quality of its light and its 2 exit points. And he came in with his hat in his hand and the specific expression of a man who had driven 2 hours to say something he'd been sitting on for a significant amount of time. Vincent, she said, Seraphina. He sat down without fuss. I won't draw this out. I retired 3 years ago, but I've been watching what's been happening with this family for most of that time, because old habits, and because I liked your father-in-law, and the particular way he understood what his family needed to be. Say what you came to say. Corvin Drax contacted me 6 weeks ago, Vincent said. He wanted me to review a document. Specifically, the succession agreement. He said there were questions about its legal standing, and he wanted an outside opinion. Seraphina went very still. I declined, Vincent said. I told him the document wasn't in my purview and that he should take his questions through appropriate channels. He thanked me and didn't push. He paused. But the reason I'm here today is that I then went and looked at my own records from when the document was originally created, and I noticed something. What did you notice? The document that Corvin described to me, the questions he asked about it, the specific clauses he referenced. He knows more about the contents of that agreement than should be possible if he'd never seen it. He held her gazes, which means someone showed it to him, or a copy of it. The air in the room felt different. Seraphina said quietly, "The original is secure." Then someone made a copy, or someone described it to him in enough detail to serve the same purpose. She stood. How specific were his questions? Specific enough to know that the guardianship clause is the critical mechanism. Specific enough to understand that whoever holds guardianship controls the agreement's activation. He paused. Specific enough to know your name is in it, which meant Corvin had known about her role for longer than she'd assumed, had possibly known from early on, and had been building his strategy around it rather than in ignorance of it. The 2-year campaign to diminish her with Maddox wasn't simply about removing an obstacle. It was about discrediting the one person whose position in the succession agreement could stop everything he was building. She had been the target all along. She had known she was a factor in his calculation. She had not known she was the central one. "Thank you, Vincent," she said. "I need you to write down everything he asked you. Every specific question, every clause he referenced. I need it in the next hour." "I brought notes," he said, and pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. She took it, looked at it. The paper was half covered in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years making sure his records were clean. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Dario. The text said Tarn agreed. "He wants to talk, but he says it needs to be tonight. And he says he needs you to know the access point that was added to the financial account 4 days ago. He says he knows who did it." She read the message twice. Then she typed back, "Where? When?" Dario responded immediately with an address, a restaurant in the city's west side that was exactly the kind of people chose when they needed to be somewhere with noise and witnesses and multiple exits and a time, 9 o'clock. She put her phone in her pocket. Vincent was watching her with the patient attention of someone who had read enough rooms to know when a room had just fundamentally changed. "I won't ask," he said. "Good," she said. And then, because she was tired, and because he had come 2 hours to hand her something important, she allowed herself a single second of honesty. "It's bigger than I thought." "It usually is," Vincent said, "when someone goes to this much trouble." He left. She sat with the notes, with Iris's financial records, with the weight of the new information reshaping the architecture of what she thought she'd understood and Schnei found. Somewhere underneath all of it, a cold, clean clarity that she recognized from the hardest moments of her life. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the whole board and realize that the person on the other side has been playing a longer game than you knew, and that the only possible response is to stop playing the game they prepared for and start playing one they never anticipated. Picked up her phone again. She called Fennec. He picked up immediately, which meant he'd been waiting. "Change of plans," she said. "How big a change?" "We're not waiting 72 hours. She kept her voice flat and certain. "We moved tonight, after I talked to Tarn. If what he knows is what I think it is, Corvin finds out this week that the people he thought were inside his plan were building a door he didn't know existed." Fennec was quiet for a moment. "And Maddox, tell him 9 o'clock. Tell him to be at the compound. Tell him to be ready." She paused. "Tell him I said it ends tonight." Fennec said, "Understood." She ended the call. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was going gray at the edges. Somewhere on the grounds, she could hear the shift change happening, guards rotating, the quiet, procedural sounds of a compound settling into its evening rhythms. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. She stood at the window and looked out at the grounds and thought about what Tarn had said, that someone had put a financial exit in Elara's name, and that he knew who had done it. Thought about who could access those accounts. Who would want to frame Elara, and why now, 4 days before the ceremony, before anyone outside a very small circle could have known what Corvin was planning? She thought about the copy of the succession agreement. She thought about how Corvin had known the specific clauses. And then, with the particular sick certainty of someone who has just placed a piece they thought was safe on the wrong square of the board, she thought about who else had known those clauses, who else had access, who else had been quiet. She picked up her keys. She had 6 hours before the meeting with Tarn, and the thing she had just understood could not wait 6 hours and could not be addressed by phone. And so she went downstairs and got into her car and drove toward the city in the gray afternoon light, carrying the knowledge that the plan she had spent 9 months building had just developed a fracture she hadn't seen coming, and that the fracture had a name, and the name was someone she had trusted. She drove fast, but not recklessly, which was a discipline she had learned early, that the moments when everything in you wants to move without thinking are exactly the moments when thinking matters most. The city came up around her in the gray late afternoon light, the familiar skyline filling the windshield as she took the expressway south, and she ran it through her head again, the specific sequence that had brought her to this realization, making sure she wasn't wrong, making sure she wasn't filling gaps with fear instead of fact. Session agreement. 4 clauses, very specific. Corvin had referenced them to Vincent with the precision of someone who had read the actual document, not just heard about it secondhand. She had kept the original in a lockbox in her private room at the compound. She had never photographed it, never digitized it, never described its specific language to anyone. Anyone except one person. 18 months ago, in a moment that felt, in retrospect, a geological fault line she had walked across without looking down. She had described 3 of those 4 clauses to the family's inside legal counsel, a woman named Petra Voss, who had been with the family for 6 years, and who had come to Seraphina with questions about the legitimacy of a secondary document that had surfaced during an unrelated financial review. Seraphina had trusted her enough to be specific. She had never been specific with anyone else. Petra Voss, 44 years old, meticulous, quietly ambitious, and this was the part Seraphina was now rebuilding in her head with the sick precision of hindsight. The person who had recommended 8 months ago that Maddox restructure certain account signatory protocols in a way that had seemed reasonable at the time, and had in fact created exactly the access vulnerabilities that Iris had spent months documenting. Petra, who had access to the financial systems, who understood the agreement, who could have provided Corvin with exactly what he needed without appearing anywhere in the trail. Seraphina at over 9 months, because Seraphina had never thought to look at her. She pulled off the expressway. She needed to think about this differently. She needed to ask the question she hadn't asked yet, which was not just how Petra was connected to Corvin, but what Petra actually wanted, because people who take enormous risks inside complicated systems almost always want something specific, and the thing they want is usually the clearest thing about them if you know to look for it. Petra had joined the family 6 years ago, recommended by a firm that had since dissolved. She had no previous Virelli connection. She had built her position carefully, made herself indispensable, stayed close to the legal and financial architecture of the family without ever seeming to reach for anything more. Except she had been promoted 14 months ago to a position that gave her access to the primary family accounts. 14 months ago, the same window as Alara. Seraphina sat in her car on the side of a surface street with the engine running and felt the shape of it come into focus with the specific, cold clarity of something you wish you could unsee. Corvin hadn't recruited Alara and discovered Petra separately. They were the same operation. Alara had been the visible element, the distraction, the theater, the thing everyone looked at. Petra had been the infrastructure, the success, the quiet engine underneath the performance. She had been building the wrong map. She took out her phone and called Iris. The access point created 4 days ago, she said, the moment Iris picked up. Proxy account in Alara's name. Can you tell me what device it was created from? I already pulled that, Iris said. It was created from a device registered to the family's internal legal network. Petra Voss. Silence, then. That's how did you. How long has she had the access to create that kind of proxy account? 14 months. Iris's voice had changed. Seraphina. 14 months is also when the first account duplications started. I'd trace those to Corvin, but if Petra was the one actually. She was the mechanism, Seraphina said. Corvin was the architect. Petra executed it from the inside. Check everything she's touched since she joined the family. Everything. That's at 6 years of records. I know. Start with the last 14 months and work backward. She paused. And Iris, do not mention this to anyone. Not yet. She ended the call. She sat for another moment. Then she called Dario. He picked up before the second ring. I was about to call you. What happened? Tarn moved the meeting. He wants it now, not 9 o'clock. He sent me his location, not the restaurant, a different address. He said it to be now, because someone knows he agreed to talk. His voice was careful and precise, the way it got when he was managing alarm. Seraphina, I don't love this. What's the address? He gave it. It was a warehouse on the city's eastern edge, which was a different kind of meeting location than a restaurant, fewer exits, less noise, no incidental witnesses. The change in venue from a public space to a private one, made urgently and at short notice, was exactly the kind of thing that should make someone turn around and drive the other direction. She recognized that. She drove toward it anyway. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. You're not coming. Seraphina. If I walk in with backup, he shuts down. He came to me because he thinks I'll listen. You stay near your phone. She paused. If you don't hear from me in 90 minutes, call Fennec. She didn't wait for his response. The warehouse was in an industrial block that had been half converted into storage units for a logistics company. The kind of building that looks completely ordinary from the outside and echoes badly on the inside. There were 2 vehicles in the side lot when she arrived: Tarn's black sedan, which she recognized, and a silver car she didn't. She sat in her own car for 30 seconds, watching, and saw no movement. She went in. Tarn was standing near the center of the space, hands visible, jacket open, in the unconscious signal of a man trying to communicate that he wasn't prepared for violence. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered face of someone who had spent 25 years making hard choices and living alongside their consequences. He looked exactly as Dario had said, like a man who was frightened. The silver car's owner was standing 6 feet to Tarn's right. It was Petra Voss. Seraphina stopped walking. She had 1 second, a single full second, in which her body went ahead of her mind and understood the situation while her mind was still catching up. She used that second to check the space around her, the exits she'd clocked on the way in, the distance to each, the position of the 2 people in front of her. Then her mind arrived. Tarn, she said. Her voice came out level, which cost her more than she showed. I'm sorry, Tarn said. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it, which made it significantly worse. She knew I was going to talk to you. I didn't have a choice about this part. There's always a choice about this part, Seraphina said. That's a very easy thing to say, Petra said, from where you're standing. Seraphina looked at her. 44 years old, controlled, wearing the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed this conversation and is now in the opening of it. She was holding a phone, not a weapon, which could mean she wasn't a physical threat, or could mean the physical threat was coming from somewhere else. How long, Seraphina said. Petra tilted her head slightly. Which part of it? How long have you been working with Corvin? 4 years. She said it without hesitation. I was his placement. The firm that recommended me to the family he owns it. It's a shell, but it's a functional one. She paused. I know you've been building a case. I know you have 9 months of financial records and a trail that leads to Corvin through Belov. I know about the succession agreement, and I know about Vincent Caro's visit today because I have access to the compound security logs. Seraphina said nothing. What I have, Petra continued, is everything you've built. The records Iris has been keeping. The notes from your meetings with Fennec. The timeline you assembled. She held up the phone. It's all been copied. If you move against Corvin with what you have, he'll have a counterfiling ready within hours that discredits every piece of it because I know exactly how each piece was gathered, and I can document the chain of custody problems well enough to make a very good lawyer very nervous. The particular cold of what she was hearing moved through Seraphina without expression. You've been mirroring my files, she said, for 7 months, since you started actually building the case, rather than just watching. Petra's voice was professional, almost clinical. You're very good, Seraphina. Genuinely. I want you to know I'm saying that without sarcasm. What you put together on Corvin is thorough and damaging, and under normal circumstances would be decisive. But I've been building a parallel file for the same amount of time that attributes every piece of it to you, that characterizes the financial irregularities as your operation, that documents your access to the succession agreement and frames that access as misuse. She paused. This goes to confrontation. Both files go public simultaneously. What the family sees is a war between two equally compromised versions of events. In that scenario, the person with the most credibility wins. And you've spent 2 years making sure that person is Corvin. We have, Petra said. Yes. Tarn had not moved. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man sitting inside a mistake he made some time ago and has been living inside ever since. Seraphina looked at him briefly. What did they have on you? She said. He looked up. My son, he said, one word. Nothing else. She understood. She didn't push it. What do you want? She said to Petra. Petra lowered the phone slightly.
You walk away from the succession agreement.
You release guardianship to a third party specifically, to the legal firm Corvin designates. You do it in writing tonight, witnessed and dated. Change, the parallel file disappears, and you retain your position in the family, as Maddox's wife, with no further interference. I become ornamental. You become safe, Petra said, which is better than what the alternative looks like. Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. She was aware of several things simultaneously, that her phone was in her jacket pocket, and she could reach it, that the nearest exit was 40 feet behind her, that Petra was controlled, but not entirely calm. There was a slight tension in the hand holding the phone, kind that came from someone who had prepared for many responses to this conversation, but was not completely certain which one she was getting, and that Tarn, standing silently to the right, was still breathing like a man who hadn't entirely committed to the side he appeared to be on. You said you've been mirroring my files for 7 months, Seraphina said. That's right, including my communications with Iris. Yes. So you have access to what Iris sent me this afternoon. Pause brief, controlled, but there. Yes. Then you know what Iris found, Seraphina said. The access point created 4 days ago. The proxy account. I know about it. You created it, Seraphina said, in Alara's name. 4 days before the ceremony, when you'd confirmed the ceremony was happening and you needed a financial exit prepared in case the plan failed and Corvin needed to redirect blame quickly. She kept her voice completely flat. That wasn't Corvin's instruction, was it? He doesn't know you did it. The tension in Petra's hand increased. You built yourself an insurance policy, Seraphina said, against Corvin. Because you've been inside this long enough to understand that when men like him reach the finish line, the people who built the road for them don't always get to attend the celebration. Petra said nothing. So you created a parallel track, Seraphina continued. A version of events where the financial manipulation traces to Alara, which Corvin can use, and a separate version where it traces somewhere else, something only you control, which you can use against Corvin if he turns on you. She paused. You're not here because Corvin sent you. You're here because you got to me before he did. The silence stretched. Then Petra said, very quietly, he's going to move tomorrow. The floor shifted under the conversation. What do you mean? Seraphina said. Found out about Tarn. He knows Tarn was going to talk to you, not through me, through one of his own people who's been watching Tarn for weeks. He's moved the timeline. She looked at Seraphina with something that might have been, under the professionalism, a genuine thing. He's sending people to the compound tomorrow morning, not to negotiate, to take control. How many? 4 captains who are fully committed. Belov's team provides financial cover. He's going to walk in and present a fait accompli, the compound controlled, the accounts frozen, the succession agreement challenged in court before you can activate it. Can't challenge the agreement without showing he knows what's in it. He's going to use me, Petra said. I testify that you described it to me, which is true, and that, in describing it, you were soliciting legal advice on how to use it against Maddox, which is not true, but which I can make plausible. She met Seraphina's eyes. Thinks I'm still his. He thinks this meeting isn't happening. Seraphina looked at her. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because I told you he's going to discard me. I've known it for 2 months. The moment this is done and his position is secured, I become a witness who knows too much. Her voice didn't break, but it came close to something. I'm not doing this out of conscience. I want you to know I'm not pretending it's that. Then what? I want out, Petra said. Completely out. New identity, new city, resources to establish myself, and a document signed by you and Maddox that acknowledges my cooperation, and guarantees I'm not pursued. She paused. In exchange, I give you everything. Every file, every communication, every piece of evidence Corvin doesn't know I have, including recordings. Recordings. 8 months of them. She reached into her jacket and produced a small drive. He talks freely around me. He has for 4 years. He trusted me completely, which was his version of the same mistake you made. Seraphina looked at the drive. She thought about what was on it 8 months of Corvin Drax talking freely to the person he trusted most. The kind of material that didn't need a chain of custody argument, because it was primary, direct, undeniable. She thought about the timeline. Tomorrow morning, not 72 hours, 12. She thought about Maddox, at the compound, waiting for 9 o'clock. She thought about the plan she'd spent 9 months building and the fracture that had developed in it, and the fact that the fracture, paradoxically, had just handed her something her plan had never had. I need to make a call, she said. You have 5 minutes, Petra said. After that I walk, and you deal with tomorrow, without this. Seraphina turned away and pulled out her phone. She called Maddox, picked up on the first ring. Where are you? Listening, she said. I need you to do something right now, without asking me why, and I need you to do it in the next 10 minutes. A pause. Tell me. Call Fennec. Have him secure the compound, all access points. All staff, no exceptions. Tell him to contact Dario and the 3 captains Fennec trusts personally. Have them at the compound before 7 o'clock. Seraphina. Corvin moves tomorrow morning. We don't have 72 hours. We have tonight. She kept her voice low and steady. Can you do that right now? Another pause, shorter. Yes. Good. She hesitated for just a moment, Maddox. Don't open the gate for anyone you don't personally recognize. Anyone. She ended the call. She turned back to Petra. One condition, she said. Name it, Tarn. She looked at him, still standing in the same spot, with the same expression of a man trapped inside a decision he'd made a long time ago. He walks with the same terms you're getting. He cooperates fully. He testifies, if it comes to that, and in exchange his son is not touched, and he is not pursued. Petra looked at her, then at Tarn. Something moved across her face that might have been calculation, or might have been something more human. That's not my decision, she said. You just told me you have recordings of 8 months of Corvin Drax, Seraphina said. That makes it entirely your decision. Silence. Agreed, Petra said. Seraphina held out her hand for the drive. Petra hesitated, the last hesitation, the one that happens when a person lets go of the insurance policy they've been carrying and becomes genuinely, irreversibly vulnerable. And then she placed the drive in Seraphina's palm. It was small, ordinary looking, the kind of object that carries the weight of years. Seraphina closed her hand around it. She looked at Petra and then at Tarn, and she said, You both have 30 minutes to get somewhere that isn't here. Don't use your phones until I tell you it's safe. Don't contact each other. Don't contact anyone connected to the family. And then, Tarn said, first words he'd spoken in 10 minutes. Seraphina said, It ends tonight instead of tomorrow. She walked back to her car in the gray evening air, the drive in her pocket and the weight of the revised timeline pressing on every step, and she was halfway to the compound before she allowed herself to feel, for just a fraction of a second, the full dimensions of what she was carrying. 9 months of careful, methodical construction. The plan she had built brick by brick, timeline by timeline, source by source. It was not destroyed. It was not even critically damaged. But it had been penetrated, observed, mirrored, and nearly used against her by someone sitting inside it. And that meant every assumption she'd made about the security of her own operation was wrong. She drove faster. She had the drive. She had the recordings. She had Tarn and Petra as cooperating witnesses with direct knowledge of Corvin's operation. She had the succession agreement. She had Maddox, finally, on the right side of the information gap. She had Fennec and Dario and the core of the family's loyal structure. What she didn't have was time. Corvin would find out about Petra before morning. He had people watching. Tarn, he might already know about the meeting. If he moved the timeline again, if he moved tonight instead of tomorrow, the compound needed to be ready for something that looked less like a negotiation and more like a siege. Her phone rang. Dario. She answered without taking her eyes off the road. I need to tell you something, Dario said, and his voice had lost the careful, professional register she was used to. He sounded younger than 32. Something just happened. Tell me. Belov just drove through the compound's east gate, he said. He said Maddox called him in, but Maddox is standing right here next to me, and he says he didn't call anyone. She felt the cold move through her cleanly and completely. How many people came in with Belov? She said. 3, Dario said. Seraphina, they're armed. She pressed the accelerator to the floor. The compound was 15 minutes away at legal speed, and she made it in 9. And the entire time she drove, she understood with the precision of someone who had just watched a plan accelerate past its intended sequence that what had been a careful, controlled dismantling of Corvin's operation had just become something harder and faster and considerably more dangerous than anything she had prepared for. Corvin hadn't waited for morning, and the person who had let Belov through the east gate, the person who had told him Maddox had called, the person who had been on the compound security team long enough to make that call credibly, whose access she had not yet managed to revoke because she hadn't known to revoke it until 40 minutes ago. That person had just turned the clock on everything. She'd built into something that ran on Corvin's schedule instead of hers. She hit the compound road and saw the lights of the east wing burning, and she understood that the next hour would require her to be something she had spent 9 months very carefully avoiding being, not the woman behind the plan, not the guardian of the document, not the one who watched and waited and built, the one who walked in, came through the compound's main gate at speed and didn't stop at the guardhouse, which told her immediately that something was wrong with the guard rotation, because the man on duty didn't step out to check her, just waved her through without looking, and she noted his face as she passed and didn't recognize it. That was the first thing. The second thing was that the east wing lights were wrong, too many of them, on. The kind of over-illumination that happens when people who don't know a space well turn on everything they can find instead of knowing which lights they need. Pulled around to the north entrance, which was the smallest access point, and the one least likely to be covered, and got out of the car and moved toward the building in the way she'd learned to move, in the hardest years of this marriage, quietly, with purpose. Without announcing herself, her phone buzzed. Dario. She answered and kept walking. East sitting room, he said, low and fast. Belov has Maddox. Fennec is with them. Belov's people have the room, but they haven't locked it down yet. They're waiting for something. Waiting for Corvin. Has to be. Maddox says he's not hurt, but Seraphina, one of Belov's men, put a gun on Fennec when he moved, and Maddox stopped talking after that. Where are you? Corridor. Outside the library. I've got Cassin with me. She heard another voice, very low, in the background, and 2 of Fennec's people who were in the north wing when Belov came through. Stay there. Don't move until I get to you. Seraphina. Corvin's car just came through the east gate. She moved faster. The north entrance brought her through the kitchen corridor, past the staff rooms, into the back passage that ran parallel to the main hall. She knew this building the way she knew her own hands, had walked every corridor, knew every door, had spent 15 years understanding the architecture of the place she lived in, with the unconscious thoroughness of someone who had always known, at some level, that she might need that knowledge. She came out through the passage door into the corridor outside the library and found Dario pressed against the wall, with 2 of Fennec's men, both of them older, competent-looking, with the controlled alertness of people who had been trained for situations like this, and were doing the work of not showing how much they didn't like it. Dario looked at her the way people look at someone they are genuinely relieved to see, which she filed away, and didn't have time to respond to. Drive, she said to the taller of Fennec's men. Harlan, he said. Harlan. How many of Belov's people are in the east wing? 3 went in with him. 4th's the gate man new face wasn't on the roster. He kept his voice level and quiet. 1 more, that we've clocked in the exterior, east side, watching the terrace. 5 total, that we can account for. Corvin came alone? Driver. That's it. As far as we saw, she ran the math quickly. 5 plus Corvin's driver against 4 people in this corridor, and whatever Maddox could do in the room, which, depending on how effectively Belov had neutralized him, was either a great deal or nothing at all. The drive, Dario said suddenly quietly. You have the recordings? Yes. If Corvin doesn't know Petra gave them to you. He doesn't. Not yet. She looked at him. I need to get to that room before he does. He's already in the building, Dario said. Seraphina, was already moving. The east sitting room was at the end of the main corridor, past the formal dining room and the portrait hall, which meant one long, straight approach, with nowhere to step off it if someone came the other direction. She moved fast and low, and didn't think about what happened if she encountered one of Belov's men before she reached the room, because that was a variable she couldn't control, and spending attention on uncontrollable variables was a luxury that the next 4 minutes didn't have room for. She heard voices from the sitting room before she reached it. Corvin's voice, already there. She was too late for the approach she wanted. She stopped at the doorway and took one breath, just one, deliberate, and went in. The room had 6 people in it. Maddox stood near the fireplace with his jacket still on and his hands loose at his sides, which meant he'd made a decision about how to hold himself, and the decision was controlled and not passive, which she recognized and which helped. Fennec was seated not by choice. She could see that with one of Belov's men standing 2 feet behind him. Belov himself was near the window, which was where men stood when they wanted the room's primary light on everyone else. 2 more of his people occupied the room's corners with the practiced stillness of professional threat. Corvin stood in the center. He looked, at 60 years old, exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 4 decades building toward a single outcome and who believed, at this particular moment, that he was standing inside it. He was not visibly armed. He didn't need to be visibly armed. He had Belov's people for that, and he had the particular armor of a man who genuinely believes the room has already been decided in his favor. He turned when she came in. His expression didn't change much. A slight recalibration around the eye's surprise managed into neutrality in about half a second, which was fast, but not fast enough to be invisible. Seraphina, he said. Corvin. She came fully into the room and let the door stay open behind her. She didn't look at Maddox, not yet. Looking at Maddox right now would signal to everyone in the room that she needed something from him. I wondered if you'd come yourself or send someone. I find that the things that matter most are worth attending personally. I agree completely. She moved to the side of the room that put her equidistant from Belov and from Maddox, which was not comfortable, but which was the right geometry. We were expecting you in the morning. Something moved in his eyes. Were you? Tarn talked, she said. She said it simply, without drama. He told me the timeline. He told me the plan. He told me about the 4 captains you've been cultivating. She paused. I adjusted. Corvin looked at her for a long moment. She watched him process what she'd said and assess what it meant and arrive at the conclusion he arrived at, which was that Tarn's defection was a setback but not necessarily catastrophic, depending on what Tarn actually knew and how much Seraphina had been able to do with it in the hours since. Tarn, he said, is a man who makes decisions based on fear. Most people do, she said. It doesn't make the decisions less real. What exactly do you think you know? He said, and the professional warmth dropped out of his voice, leaving something cooler and more honest underneath it. I know about the power of attorney modification. I know about the account duplications through Belov's network. I know about the firm you used to place Petra Voss in the family's legal structure 6 years ago. She watched him absorb each item. I know you spent 14 months building Alara into something you could deploy and then dispose of. I know about the successions agreement, and I know that you've had a partial understanding of its contents for at least 18 months. Partial, he said. You didn't know everything, she said. That's going to matter. Seraphina. He moved toward the center of the room, and she held her position, and they faced each other across 6 feet of expensive carpet in a room full of armed men and a silence that had the specific quality of a held breath. I've been building this for 4 years. I want you to understand that. 4 years of patience, of precision, of I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that, of genuine respect for what you're capable of. You are the most formidable person in this family. That is exactly why. I spent 2 years making Maddox forget it. I know, she said. Then you know that what you have, whatever Tarn gave you, whatever evidence you've assembled, it's not enough. Not tonight. Not against the operational control I have in place right now. He gestured briefly toward Belav, toward the room, the specific economics of force. Compound is mine tonight. The accounts are locked within the hour. The succession agreement can be legally challenged before morning on grounds that the guardianship appointment was never properly witnessed under current standards. He stopped. I'm telling you this because I'm offering you something. Walk away from the guardianship. Right now, in this room, witnessed and recorded. Keep your life here, your position. Everything except the one piece of paper that's been putting you in the middle of something that was always going to end badly for whoever stood between me and this family's future. Maddox made a sound, not a word a sound, low and controlled, the kind that comes out of a man who is working very hard to maintain the stillness he's chosen and is running against the limits of that choice. Maddox, Seraphina said, not looking at him, still holding Corvin's eyes. Not yet. She heard him go still again. You've told me what you think you have, she said to Corvin. Here's what you don't know. She reached into her jacket pocket and placed the drive on the table between them. Corvin looked at it. Petra came to me tonight, she said, before you did. She gave me 8 months of recordings. Corvin, 8 months of your conversations with her specific, detailed, personally incriminating conversations about the account structures, the captain recruitment, the legal strategy, Ilara, the ceremony. She kept her voice even and precise. She gave me the financial footprint you created, using her access and documented through her records. She gave me every communication between you and Belov going back 11 months. The room was very quiet. She also gave me the access point she created in Ilara's name. 4 days ago, Seraphina continued. She created without your knowledge, as insurance against you, which I now have. Which means the parallel file she was running, the counter-evidence she built against my case, I have that too. All of it, on your side and mine. Corvin had gone still in the particular way that very intelligent people go still when they are rapidly rebuilding their model of a situation. She watched it happen. It was not pleasant to watch. It had the quality of watching something structural fail. So, Petra, he said. She knew you were going to discard her, Seraphina said. She'd known for 2 months, she said. I think she'd probably known longer than that. I think she started the recordings when she first understood what kind of man you actually were, which takes most people about 3 years inside. A relationship like the one you had with her. She paused. You trusted her completely. That was the same mistake you spent 4 years trying to use against Maddox. Something happened in Corvin's face. It wasn't collapse. The man had too much structure for collapse, but it was a fracture, clean and visible, the moment when the architecture meets the load it wasn't designed to carry. The recordings aren't admissible, he said. In a courtroom, possibly. In front of this family's captains, in a council session, held under the succession agreement's authority which I am activating tonight. Corvin, they're not evidence in a legal sense. They're testimony. They're the truth in a room full of people who have pledged their loyalty to this family and who have been operated against, manipulated, and recruited without their knowledge. She reached into her jacket again, and this time produced the succession document, not a copy, the original, in its sealed folder. This document gives me the authority to call that session. Tonight. With every captain in attendance. You can't get them here tonight. Fennec has been on the phone for the last 40 minutes, she said. She looked at Fennec until the light changed. For the first time, he was sitting with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to be in the right moment and has just arrived at it. He gave her a small nod. Belov moved away from the window. He moved away from the window and 2 steps toward the center of the room, which repositioned him away from Corvin and toward the neutral space. And it was such a small physical movement that in a different room, it might have meant nothing at all. In this room, it meant everything. Corvin saw it. Belov, he said. Belov didn't look at him. I've been doing the accounting, Belov said. He had a heavy, flat voice, the voice of a man who communicated in quantities rather than qualities. He was looking at the drive on the table and then at the document in Seraphina's hands. 11 months I've been inside this. 11 months because you told me the alternative was worse than the arrangement. He paused. 8 months of recordings is a lot of accounting. You don't know what's on those recordings. I know what I said to you, Belov said. I know exactly what I said and when. Corvin turned fully to face him, and in doing so turned partially away from Seraphina, which was the first positional mistake he'd made. 11 months ago I made you promises about what your position in this family would look like when this was done. Those promises stand. They stand if you're in a position to keep them, Belav said. Are you in that position right now? The silence had a different texture now. Not the silence of a held breath, but the silence of a room reconfiguring itself around a new center of gravity. Corvin's two men in the corners looked at each other. The man behind Fennec took a half step back. Maddox moved from the fireplace to the center of the room. Not quickly, not with theater, just moved, closed the distance between himself and the table, and stood. Corvin looked at him. You have nothing, Maddox said. His voice was low, and it was damaged, in the way that voices get when something has been burning in a person for several hours, without being allowed to surface. You have this room right now, for about 60 more seconds. Maddox, 4 years. Maddox said it the way you say the number of years a sentence runs, not the way you say a duration. 4 years in this house, eating at this table, standing next to me and telling me what you thought I needed to hear. His jaw worked, telling me she was the problem. She landed in the room, and everyone in it knew who it referred to, and Corvin was smart enough to know that the conversation had moved past the territory where his particular skills were effective. Council, Seraphina said. It's already called. Captains arrive in the next 90 minutes. She looked at Corvin directly. You can be present for it as a responding party with the right to speak, or you can leave this compound right now, and the council proceeds without you. And you can imagine what that looks like. You can't guarantee my safety in that, council, he said. No, she said. I can't, but I can guarantee that if you leave, there's no version of the next 24 hours where that goes better for you. She paused. Stay. Let the record be made. What happens after is determined by what the captains decide, and that's as close to a fair process as this world offers. Corvin looked at the drive, at the document, at Belav, who was no longer his, at the two men in the corners who were reading the room the way men in that profession read rooms as a set of odds, as a survival calculation, and who were arriving at the same conclusion he was arriving at. You planned this, he said to Seraphina. Not the accusation it might have been. Something more like a statement of recognition. Not just tonight. The entire 9 months you planned for it to reach this point. I planned for it to reach a point where the truth was undeniable, she said. The specific shape of tonight wasn't in my plan. You moved faster than expected and I adjusted. And the adjustment was Petra. The adjustment was letting the fractures in your structure do the work, she said. You built something that required everyone to stay afraid all the time. Fear is a load-bearing material, Corvin, but it only holds as long as the people carrying it believe the alternative is worse. She held his gaze. Petra didn't believe it anymore. Belav doesn't believe it anymore. Tarn never believed it, he was just stuck. She let a beat pass. How many people do you have left who still believe it? His driver was outside. His two corner men were reading odds. He looked around the room, with the particular expression of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, no next move that improves his position. Then his right-hand corner man made a quiet sound, reached inside his jacket, and placed his weapon on the floor. The other followed, 3 seconds apart, which was the time it took the second man to watch the first make the decision and determine that the decision was correct. Belav's men, by extension, stood down. Corvin stood in the center of the room without his architecture around him, and he was still a formidable man, still composed, still carrying 40 years of learned authority in the set of his shoulders. But he was a formidable man whose levers had just been disconnected, and that was a different thing entirely. Straightened his jacket, an entirely involuntary gesture, the body doing what it does when everything else has failed it. I'll attend the council, he said. Seraphina nodded once. She looked at Dario, who appeared in the doorway, looking slightly breathless and entirely focused, and she said, Get Corvin's men off the grounds. Politely, then get me a secure line to Iris and call in the remaining captains. Dario nodded and moved. She looked at Fennec, who stood up from the chair, with the careful dignity of a man who was 71 and had been waiting 3 decades for an evening that looked something like this one, and who was going to conduct himself accordingly. Fennec, she said. Council chamber. 20 minutes, he said. She looked at Maddox last. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her, she thought, since she walked in the door, not in the way he'd looked at her across dinner tables. For the last 2 years, not with the comfortable near invisibility of a long marriage running on procedural familiarity, but in the way he had looked at her a long time ago, in the first years when he was still capable of being surprised by her. "Are you all right?" she said. A pause. "No," he said, "but not in a way that matters right now." She understood that. "Council chamber," she said. "Both of us." She moved toward the door, and as she passed the table, she picked up the drive and pocketed it, and picked up the succession document and held it. She walked out of the east sitting room and down the main corridor toward the council chamber, with the sounds of the compound reorganizing itself around a new fact, a new order, a new center of gravity, and she felt somewhere beneath the adrenaline and the exhaustion and the cold, clean focus, the specific gravity of what was about to happen. Not the plan. The plan had broken and been rebuilt and broken again, and she had built it again from what the fractures gave her, and now it was reaching the moment that all of it had been building toward. Not an ending, a reckoning. The council chamber doors were at the end of the corridor. Through them, in the next hour, every man who had pledged his loyalty to this family would sit across a table from the evidence of what had been done to them, and Corvin Drax would stand in the room where he had built his architecture and watch it be dismantled piece by careful piece. She pushed the doors open. The chamber was already lit, already filling. Captains coming in from different doors, some arriving from across the city, some who had been on compound grounds, and summoned up from wherever Corvin's arrival had scattered them. They looked at her when she walked in. One by one, the same way they had looked at her in the ballroom 3 nights ago, not with the theater of that night, not with the performance of men being watched, but with the quiet, bone-deep recognition of people who have been looking at the wrong thing for a long time and have just found, again, what they were supposed to be looking at. She went to the head of the table. She placed the succession document on it. She opened it, and then Corvin Drax walked through the chamber door, and every head in the room turned, and the reckoning began. The council chamber held 14 men that night, plus Corvin Drax, plus Seraphina, plus Maddox standing to the left of the head of the table with his jacket still on and his hands flat on the wood, and the expression of a man who has been taken apart and is deciding, in real time, what to put back and what to leave on the floor. Fennec sat at the table's midpoint, which was where he always sat, the position that was neither head nor foot, the position of a man who had always understood that his authority came from being trusted by both sides simultaneously. He had a notepad in front of him that he didn't use. He had the face he got when things were serious, which was almost indistinguishable from his normal face, except that his eyes moved less. Dario stood near the door. Not seated, he hadn't been invited to the table as a full captain, and he knew it, and he stood near the door anyway, because standing near the door was close enough that he could hear everything, and far enough that no one could formally object to his presence. Corvin sat at the chair that had been placed for him, not at the table, but offset from it, in the position that was understood, without anyone having to say it, respondent, the chair of a man being heard rather than convening. He sat in it with perfect composure, which Seraphina noted and respected even now, because composure under those specific circumstances was genuinely hard, and she had always been honest, at least internally, about what Corvin was capable of. She placed the drive in the center of the table. She said, "We'll begin with the recordings." The chamber had a speaker system installed 15 years ago, for exactly these kinds of proceedings, and Dario connected the drive in 30 seconds, and then the voice of Corvin Drax began to fill the room. 8 months of recordings. They didn't play all of it, they didn't need to. Seraphina had listened to enough of it in the car, on the drive back, to know which segments the structural weight, and she directed Dario to the timestamps with the quiet precision of someone who had been preparing this presentation since before she had the material to fill it. The first segment was from 11 months ago. Corvin's voice, unhurried and specific, walking Belov through the account duplication process. Not the theory of it, the actual mechanics, the actual account numbers, the actual names of the banking contacts who had made it possible. The second segment was from 9 months ago, Corvin describing to Petra Voss, the specific legal approach he intended to use against the succession agreement. He referenced the guardianship clause by name. He described Seraphina's role with a clinical precision that was, in its own way, more damning than any overtly hostile language would have been the calm, considered precision of a man managing a known variable. The third segment was from 6 months ago, and it was the one that changed the texture of the room. It was Corvin talking to someone whose voice Seraphina had not previously identified on the recordings, someone who was not Petra and not Belov, someone with a younger voice, and a particular quality of deference that suggested he was not a senior figure, but was close enough to Corvin's operation to be trusted with specifics. And what Corvin was telling this unknown person was that Alara Sloane's usefulness had a terminus, a specific point, after which she became a liability, and that the management of that liability had already been planned. He did not specify what the management looked like. He didn't need to. The room understood. At the far end of the table, one of the older captains, a man named Greer, who had served the Virelli family for 27 years, and who had the specific weathered quality of someone who had outlasted several versions of this organization, put his hand down on the table very quietly. Not a gesture, just a placement. But every man in the room felt it. Seraphina stopped the recording. She looked at Corvin. He was sitting with his hands folded and his face composed, and she could see, underneath the composure, something that was not quite fear and not quite defeat, but was the particular quality of a man who has heard his own voice saying the things he actually thought, and is understanding, possibly for the first time, what those things sound like in a room full of people who are not him. The unknown voice in that segment, she said. The third recording. Who is he? Corvin said nothing. Corvin, she kept her voice level. We can identify the voice. It will take time, and it's time this council doesn't need to spend if you tell us now. A pause. Long enough that several people in the room shifted their weight. His name is Sable, Corvin said. He's external, not family. Meaning I contracted him for specific contingencies. He said it the way someone reads a prepared statement, with the flat affect of a man who has decided that the truth, at this point, is less dangerous than the inference the room will otherwise draw. Contingencies relating to Alara Sloane, among others. The silence that followed had a very specific quality. Seraphina had been in enough rooms with these men to know the difference between the silence of shock and the silence of resolution, and what she was hearing was the latter, the particular quiet that settles over people who have just moved from uncertainty to certainty and are now simply determining what to do with it. She looked at Maddox. He was looking at the table. His jaw was working slowly, the way it did when he was keeping something very controlled that wanted to be considerably less controlled. She had seen that jaw working before, in 15 years of marriage, and she knew that what was underneath it right now was not the cold strategic anger that made him effective, but something rawer and less manageable. She needed to get him through the next 10 minutes, without that rawness making a decision for him. Maddox, she said quietly, and he looked up. She met his eyes. She didn't say anything else. She just held the look, steady and direct, for long enough that she felt him find something to anchor to and use it. He looked back at the table. He breathed. She continued. She walked the room through the financial documentation methodically, and without drama, the account duplications, the power of attorney modification, the 6-year placement of Petra Voss, 14-month construction of Alara as an operational vehicle. She laid it out as Iris had assembled it, clean, sourced, sequential, the kind of evidence that doesn't make arguments because it doesn't need to. Captains asked questions. Not hostile questions. The hostility in the room was directional, and it wasn't aimed at her but precise ones. The questions of men who understood financial structures and wanted to know exactly how deep the damage ran. She answered everyone. At one point, Corvin interjected, not loudly, with a procedural objection about the sourcing of one of the financial records. Greer, from the far end of the table, said, "Sit down, Corvin," without looking up from the document in front of him, and Corvin sat down. The proceedings ran for 91 minutes. At the end of them, Fennec asked the room for a formal position. He did it the old way, going around the table, each man stating his position directly. No proxies, no ambiguity. It took 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, The position of the council was unanimous, which had not happened in this room in Seraphina's memory, and which she suspected had not happened in Phoenix either, because he wrote it in his notepad with the deliberate care of a man recording something he intends to remember precisely. Corvin listened to all 14 positions stated. He said nothing. When Fennec asked him if he wished to respond formally, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "No," and it was the only honest, uncalculated thing she had heard him say all evening. Council adjourned. What followed was not dramatic. The men filed out, with the subdued efficiency of people who had a great deal of work ahead of them, account restorations, captain communications, careful unwinding of 11 months of structural compromise, and who understood that the work had to start before the adrenaline of the evening was fully off. Dario collected the drive and the copied financial records. Fennec stayed behind to coordinate. Corvin sat in the respondent's chair and didn't move until Seraphina told him he could go. Stood. He straightened his jacket, that same involuntary gesture as before. He looked at her across the empty table. "The Sable contract," he said. "It's inactive. I want you to know that." "I know," she said. "Petra documented it. It was one of the things she had against you." He nodded once slowly. "You would have won," he said. "If Petra had held, you would have won anyway, eventually." "Yes," she said. "How long have you known it would come to this?" She considered the honest answer. 2 years ago, I knew something was wrong. A year ago, I knew it was you. 9 months ago, I started building toward this room. She paused. But I didn't know exactly what this room would look like until about 4 hours ago. Something moved in his face. It might have been, under everything, something adjacent to respect. "What happens to me?" he said. "The council will determine the specifics," she said. "But you leave the family's operations entirely. Every position, every advisory role, every informal influence. The network you built inside this organization gets dismantled by Phoenix people over the next 30 days. The external contact Sable and whoever else you terminate, and you document the termination for our records. And personally, you leave with what's yours personally and what you've earned legitimately over 40 years, which is considerable. You don't lose what you built, honestly." She held his gaze. "That's the offer. It was always going to be the offer. I was never interested in destroying you. I was interested in stopping you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a more dangerous person than I gave you credit for," he said. "In the beginning." "I know," she said. "That was the point." He left without another word, and she stood in the empty council chamber, with the succession document on the table in front of her, and the drive in Dario's hands, and the sound of the compound reorganizing itself drifting in through the walls. And she was deeply, comprehensively tired, in the way that comes after a very long time of not being allowed to be tired. She sat down in the nearest chair. Just sat. For about 3 minutes, she sat in the council chamber by herself and didn't think about anything that needed to be thought about. And she let herself breathe in the specific way that she hadn't been breathing for 9 months, slowly, with the bottom of her lungs, without any of the controlled management of a person who is always, in some part of themselves, running a calculation. Then Maddox came back. He'd left when the council adjourned. She hadn't tracked where he'd gone, assumed he needed space, assumed he was doing the thing he did when he needed to process something, which was to be alone in a room and be angry quietly at the walls until the anger sorted itself into something he could work with. He came back without his jacket, which she noted. He only took his jacket off when he stopped performing. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table, across from her in one of the middle seats, and they were facing each other across 6 feet of old wood with the succession document between them and the empty chamber around them. He said, "Alara." She waited. "The 3rd recording," he said. "The Sable contract. It's inactive." He confirmed it. "I know it's inactive." His voice had a roughness to it that wasn't anger, was something more honest than anger. "I know that. I'm trying to..." He stopped. "Try it again. Put that crest around her neck, Seraphina, in front of everyone. Not knowing what she was involved in, but knowing what I was doing to you when I did it." Seraphina looked at him. "I knew exactly what I was doing," he said. "Corvin didn't force my hand. He prepared the ground. He removed the friction. He made the choice easy, but I made it. I wanted to make it. He pressed his hand flat on the table, A brief, hard contact. I don't know what I wanted. That's the honest answer. I don't know what I was proving, or to who. She sat with that. She had thought, at various points in the last 9 months, about what this conversation would look like. She had run versions of it in her head the way you run scenarios, not with hope, not with dread, but with the practical thoroughness of someone who knows the conversation is coming and wants to be ready for all its possible shapes. None of the versions she'd run had felt quite like this. This was quieter. This was a man not making arguments. She's not here anymore, Seraphina said. Is she? No. He looked at the table. She left 2 hours ago. Dario arranged transport. He paused. I asked him to. I told her I tried to be honest with her about what she'd been inside. Without it being, I didn't want it to be cruel. She deserved to understand what actually happened. How did she take it? Better than I would have. A short, dry exhale that was almost a sound. She said she'd known for about 6 weeks that something was wrong with the situation she was in. She said she'd been trying to find an exit, she said. He stopped. She said she was sorry. To me, which he shook his head. That was harder to sit with than I expected. Seraphina understood that. People expressing genuine remorse for their role in something larger than they'd understood that was always harder to receive than anger. Anger had a shape you could push back against. She cooperated fully, Seraphina said. She told the council what she knew, which confirmed the recordings and filled in gaps that neither Petra nor Tarn could. She paused. Whatever her beginning was, her ending was honest. That counts. Maddox looked up. You protected her, he said. Even her. I protected what was true, she said. She was a tool in someone else's plan. That's not a small thing to be, and it's not a small thing to survive. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the succession document. She looked at it on the table between them. Your father gave it to me because he saw something in this marriage that you hadn't seen yet, she said. He didn't tell me what to do with it. He didn't give me instructions or a timeline. He just said, keep this safe. Know when to use it. He knew you better than I did, Maddox said. Not with bitterness, just with the flat weight of a man, stating a fact he's arrived at recently and is still getting used to. He saw me empirically, she said, for a while. That's different, is it? She looked at him. You stopped seeing me when I became familiar. That's not a crime. That's a human thing. People stop looking at what they think they already know. I let someone tell me what you were instead of looking myself. You did, she said. Yes. The honesty of it sat between them. She didn't soften it, and he didn't flinch from it, and she thought that was probably the most honest exchange they had managed in 2 years. And it was painful in the specific way that honest things are painful when you've been without them long enough to have forgotten what they feel like. What do we do now? He said. She looked at the succession document, picked it up. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, paper and ink in 31 years, and a decision made by a man who had understood something about power that most people in his position had missed entirely. She placed it in front of Maddox. He looked at it. Stays with me, she said. The guardianship. That doesn't change. But the family needs to understand what it means going forward, not as a secret and not as a check on you. Structure. Something they know exists, that they can trust exists. She paused. Your father built this organization well. What Corvin built inside it was a parasite, not a replacement. The organization survives. It just needs to know what it's built on. Maddox looked at the document, looked at her. And us, he said. She held that question for a moment, without flinching from it. It was the question she'd been the least prepared for. Not because she didn't know what she thought. Not because she didn't know what she thought, but because what she thought was complicated in ways that 9 months of focused clarity had kept her from having to examine too directly. I don't know yet, she said. I know what I said in your office 2 nights ago, that I wasn't doing this for you. That's still true. It was true then, and it's true now. And I think it's important for both of us that it's just true. She met his eyes. But I also know that what I felt when I drove through that gate tonight and walked into that room and saw Belov's man standing behind Finnick. She stopped. Let the sentence go unfinished for a moment. I know I wasn't only thinking about the succession agreement. Maddox didn't say anything. She stood up. Give it time, she said. That's all I know to say about it. Give it time, and let's see what we're like when we're not running a crisis. He stood too. They were facing each other across the table and across the document, and across 15 years and 2 years of accumulated distance, and one night that had compressed something complex into something that was simpler than it should have been, and neither of them had a neat language for it. He reached out and picked up the document, held it for a moment, put it back on the table in front of her. "It was always yours," he said. She took it. The next 10 days moved slowly after moving fast, which is of things that have been running at full speed. They don't stop cleanly. They decelerate through a series of smaller collisions. Fennec spent 3 days in the family's financial operations with Iris Fenn, unwinding the account duplications and restoring the signatory protocols that had been compromised under Petra's access. It was painstaking work and unglamorous work, and Fennec did it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the glamorous part had already happened, and this was what it was in service of. Belov cooperated, as he had said he would in the council chamber, with the completeness of a man paying a debt he considers himself genuinely to owe. He provided the specific account details, the banking contacts, the documentation of every transaction that had moved through his parallel network over 11 months. Seraphina reviewed everything. Most of it checked out. One item didn't, and she brought it to Fennec, and Fennec brought it to Belov, and Belov's explanation was credible enough that she chose to accept it, while noting that the choosing was itself a decision she was making with open eyes. Trust in the specific context of this world was never absolute. It was always a calculation. The best you could do was make the calculation honestly. Tarn and Petra were processed through the terms she'd agreed to with each of them. Tarn received documentation that his son would not be touched, signed by Seraphina as the succession agreement's guardian and countersigned by Maddox, which gave it the kind of weight that meant something. He took a leave from the family's operations that was understood to be permanent in everything, except that official designation. He shook Seraphina's hand when it was done, a long, firm handshake with both his hands around hers, and he said, "Thank you." And she said, "Your son should know what you're to do at the end." And Tarn's face did something complicated and brief that she didn't intrude on. Petra left the city on the 4th day with new documentation and resources that Seraphina had arranged through the same legal infrastructure that the family maintained for exactly this kind of need. She left no forwarding address and made no final contact. She had been, at her core, a professional, and professionals don't linger over exits. Seraphina found, in the week after, that she thought about Petra occasionally not with warmth, not with resentment, but with the specific and slightly uncomfortable recognition of one person for another who has operated at the same level of complexity and survived it. She hoped, with a genuineness she didn't entirely understand, that wherever Petra went, she was doing something that didn't require her to mirror other people's files. The crest came off Alara's neck on the night she left, not in ceremony, not with an audience. Maddox went to the guest house and asked for it back, and she gave it without drama, and he carried it back to the compound and placed it in the original case that lived in this display cabinet in the East Hall, not around anyone's neck, not presented to anyone as a transfer of authority, just in its case. Dario asked about it on the 7th day. In the casual way, he asked about things that he was actually not casual about at all. Seraphina told him it was back in the cabinet. He nodded, looked like he wanted to say something more, and then said, "Right," which was his version of saying something more. She was fond of him. She didn't say that, but she was. On the 9th day, she and Maddox had dinner together. This was not unusual. They had dinner together most evenings, a habit of proximity that had continued even through the worst of the last 2 years. But on the 9th day it was different in a way that was hard to name, and both of them felt. They talked about logistics for most of it, the ongoing financial restoration, captain restructuring that Fennec was overseeing, property matter on the Eastern Corridor that needed Maddox's direct attention, and that he had been deferring for 3 months, and that now, with the operational picture cleaner, he could actually address. Toward the end of the meal, with the food mostly done, and the wine at the level that makes honesty slightly easier to access, Maddox said, "My father told me something when we got married. I've been thinking about it this week." She waited. He said that the woman you marry in this life has to be the one who can carry the thing if you drop it. He turned his glass slowly. Thought he was talking about the family. The operations. I thought it was practical advice. He paused. I don't think that's what he meant. She looked at him. I think he meant you specifically, Maddox said. I think he'd met you and talked to you and decided something about you that he understood better than I did. And he was telling me, without quite telling me, to not be stupid about it. And were you stupid about it? For 2 years, he said, without flinching. With a lot of help, but yes. She looked at her glass. He was a careful man, your father. He was, Maddox said. I used to think I was more like him than I turned out to be. You're more like him than you were 2 weeks ago, she said. It came out with a dryness she didn't fully intend. And he looked at her. And then something happened in the room that had not happened. In a long time they both, briefly, without planning it, were almost laughing. Not quite, but the vicinity of it. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then it passed, and they were 2 people sitting across a dinner table with the full weight of everything still between them. And neither of them was naive enough to think that 4 seconds of almost laughter resolved any of it. But it was 4 seconds that hadn't existed before. The 11th day brought the formal council presentation that Seraphina had requested as the final procedural act. Not a crisis meeting, not a respondents' session, a proper formal council with the succession document read aloud in its entirety. For the first time in the family's history, with its terms and mechanisms, and the specific nature of the guardianship explained to every captain in plain language. 14 men sat in that chamber and heard for the first time the full architecture of what they had been operating inside. They heard about the guardianship. They heard Seraphina's name as its holder. They heard the specific provisions that Corvin had spent 4 years trying to manipulate and 2 years preparing to legally challenge. They heard, and there was a long silence. When Fennec finished reading, and then old Greer, 27 years, hand flat on the table said, "It should have been read to us years ago." Fennec said, "Yes, it should have." Nobody looked at Maddox directly when Greer said it. That courtesy was the room's way of acknowledging that the failure it named was his, and that they were choosing, collectively, to move past it by naming it plainly, rather than burying it. Maddox sat with it. He didn't argue, didn't deflect. She watched him take it. After the reading, Maddox stood. He reached into his jacket and produced the Virelli Crest. Not the case, the crest itself, taken from the cabinet that morning, held in his hand in the council chamber. The way he had held it in the ballroom 11 days ago, before everything that followed. He said, "What I did in the ballroom was wrong. I used this as theater when it was meant to be something else. I put it where it didn't belong because I was led there, and I let myself be led there. And both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other out." He set the crest on the table in front of Seraphina. "It doesn't go to her," he said. "It's not hers, and she hasn't asked for it. But it's also not mine right now, and I think—" He stopped, chose his words carefully. "I think leaving it here, in this room, in front of the people it's meant to serve, is more honest than where it's been." Seraphina looked at the crest on the table. She looked at Maddox. She said, "Put it back in its case." She kept her voice level and clear, not because of what it means tonight, because of what it meant to the man who first wore it. Don't let what happened to it make you afraid of it. Maddox picked it up. He held it for a moment in both hands. He put it back in its case and closed it, and he set it on the table and left it there. And that was where the council meeting ended, with the document open and the crest in its case, and 14 men around. A table that had been used, the night before last, as the instrument of something close to justice. That evening she walked the grounds. It was the first time she'd walked them without purpose, since the night of the ballroom walked them for the thing they were. 40 acres of land that had been in one family's care for 3 generations, and that had, in the last 11 days, nearly been taken from everything it was built to protect. She walked to the east wall and stood there in the dark, which was not a dramatic thing, just a thing she did when she needed to let a chapter of something close properly in her before she moved into whatever came next. The guest house light was off. She stood there for a while. Then she heard footsteps behind her Maddox. She knew by the cadence before she turned. the specific rhythm of a man who had been walking these grounds for 40 years and knew them in his feet. He came and stood beside her, not close enough to be intrusive, close enough to be present. They stood at the east wall in the dark for a long time, without saying anything, which was, she thought, its own kind of language, the language of two people who have been through something together and are choosing, neither easily nor carelessly, to still be in the same place. After a while, he said, "You were never standing beside my power." She recognized her own words in his mouth, the ones she had said in the corridor, 11 days ago before any of it. "I know what I said," she told him. "I know you do." A pause. "I just wanted to say the rest of it. The part I understood after." She waited. "You were protecting it," he said, "the whole time. You were the reason it survived." He said it without theater, without the particular performance of a man making a gesture. He said it the way you say something true that has cost you something to arrive at. "I should have known that. I should have..." Maddox stopped. "I know," she said, quiet level. And then, because it was true, and because the chapter was closing, and she had decided, sometime in the last 11 days, that the next chapter was going to be built differently, more honestly, with less managed distance, with the particular difficulty of two people actually trying, instead of one person trying, and one person being successfully managed away from seeing clearly. "I know you know." He didn't say anything else. She turned from the east wall and walked back toward the lights of the compound. And he walked beside her, and the grounds were quiet around them, and above them the night was the particular dark of a sky past all its earlier drama, settled into something that simply was what it was, without performance and without resolution, just the continuing fact of itself, moving forward. The morning of the full assembly arrived without ceremony. No rain, this time. The sky over the Moretti estate came up gray and still, the kind of flat, early light that makes everything look like it has been rinsed clean and set out to dry the courtyard stones, the iron lanterns along the gate, the long windows of the stone hall throwing back a pale reflection of a sky that couldn't decide yet what it wanted to be. Seraphina watched it from the same second-floor window she had stood at 2 days ago, counting the black SUVs pulling through the gate. She hadn't slept. She had tried, briefly, in the hours between 3 and 5, lying on the small couch in her study with her shoes still on, and had achieved something adjacent to sleep, a shallow, restless suspension in which her mind continued, working at reduced speed, processing the residue of the previous 48 hours, the way a body processes something it has ingested too quickly, in stages, imperfectly. At 5, she had given up and made coffee and sat at her desk and read through Giordano's overnight report. The 2 compromised archive locations had been accessed by Victor's people at 12:40 in the morning, approximately 90 minutes after the estate confrontation. Both sites had been found empty. The staging, Seraphina had maintained, there was convincing enough to require physical examination before it became clear that what had been retrieved was reproduction, documentation, authentic in appearance, and legally inert. Victor's people had spent 4 hours discovering this. She knew because Giordano had monitoring on both locations that Victor had never found, and the overnight report included time-stamped records of every moment of that 4-hour realization. She had read that section of the report twice, not with satisfaction exactly, with the specific, sober feeling of someone who has spent 9 years preparing for a test and has now taken it and passed it, and is sitting in the immediate aftermath, discovering that passing feels less like triumph and more like the sudden absence of pressure, a sensation so unfamiliar it takes time to identify correctly. The third archive location, the one that existed only in Giordano's memory, and hers had remained untouched throughout the night. The original documentation, signed by Aurelio Moretti, and notarized and counter-verified, and folded inside an unremarkable manila envelope, inside an unremarkable filing cabinet, in an unremarkable office building on the city's west side, had waited out the night in perfect ignorance of its own importance. By 6 in the morning, Giordano had it in hand and was en route to the estate. By 7, Seraphina had it on the archive room table, and she had sat with it for 20 minutes before she heard Dante moving on the floor above her. He came downstairs at 7:15. He was dressed for the assembly, the dark formal clothes he wore when the occasion required visible authority, the particular combination of severity and precision that the Moretti leadership had maintained across 3 generations as a kind of unspoken dress code. His face was tired. He had not shaved, which was unusual for him before a formal gathering, and the gray at his jaw made him look less like the man who had stood in this house for 2 decades commanding everything around him, and more like the man underneath, that man older, more uncertain, more human in the specific way that a person becomes more human when they've spent a night arriving at the full cost of their own choices. He came into the breakfast room and found coffee already made, and drank it standing at the counter, without sitting, looking at the window. Seraphina stayed at the table. She didn't say anything. Some mornings required a few minutes of simply existing in the same room before either of them was ready to speak, and this particular morning required more than most. After a while he said, "How many will be there?" "All 12 capos. The 4 council elders from last night, plus the remaining 8. Administrative staff and legal representation for the documentation authentication." She paused. "Giordano will be present for the first time openly." Dante absorbed this. The organization will know about Giordano's role. Yes, it's time they did. He turned from the window and looked at her. And me. What will they know about me at the end of this morning? It was the question she had been expecting, and the one she had been most careful about preparing for, because the answer had to be true without being weaponized, and the line between those two things was narrower than it looked. They will know that the head of this family was targeted by a sophisticated internal operation, and that the family's existing protective structures functioned as intended and defeated it, she said. They will know that Victor Salerno betrayed a 31-year relationship of trust, and that the consequences of that betrayal are being handled comprehensively. They will know what happened, all of what happened, parts that matter operationally. Yes, the seal, he said. The assembly. She held his gaze. That is part of the record. I won't erase it. Something moved across his face, not the flinching of a man who wants the uncomfortable fact removed, but the particular expression of a man who has decided that he no longer wants things removed on his behalf. Good, he said. Don't. He drank the rest of his coffee. He set the cup down. There's something you need to know before we go in, he said. She waited. I've been thinking about the message Celeste sent, the one designed to make me doubt what you were telling me. He looked at his own hands for a moment. I walked back anyway, not because I'd worked through everything you'd told me and verified it and reached a rational conclusion. I walked back because standing in that corridor, I couldn't identify a single thing you had ever done in 19 years that was designed to hurt me, and I couldn't say the same about anyone else in that building. He looked up at her. That's not absolution, he said. I know what I did in that assembly. I know what it cost you. I'm not asking you to. Dante, she said. He stopped. I know, she said. They looked at each other across the breakfast room in the flat morning light, and what passed between them in that look was not reconciliation in any clean or resolved sense. It was a something more honest than that, the acknowledgement of 2 people who have arrived at a clearing on the other side of something very dense and difficult, and who are both, for the first time, standing in it without the cover of roles or architecture, or the careful management of what the other person was allowed to see. After a moment she stood. 8 o'clock, she said. The stone hall was full. Every seat that existed for formal assembly was occupied, and additional staff lined the walls. The assembly had the charged, static quality of a room full of people who all know that what is about to happen will change the shape of the organization they have spent their lives inside, and who are managing their awareness of this with varying degrees of success. Some faces were openly tense. Some were composed in the deliberate way of people who have decided in advance that whatever happens, they will not be surprised by it. Emilio, near the front, was simply watching the door with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing for a long time. Seraphina entered first. She was aware of the quality of attention that shifted in the room when she came through the door, and she let it land without adjusting her pace or her expression. She walked to her position at the front of the assembly, not behind the ceremonial table, not to the side where she had stood for years in a dozen formal gatherings as Dante's wife and background presence. She stood at the table itself, with the documentation folder and Giordano beside her, and she looked at the room. Dante entered 30 seconds later. He walked to the table, stood beside her, not in front of her, beside her. The distinction was small in physical terms, and enormous in every other sense, and she saw it register across the assembly, in a slow wave, the recalibration of 12 CAPSO and council members, while processing the spatial arrangement, and drawing from it the conclusion it was designed to communicate. This assembly is called to address a matter of internal security and organizational integrity, Dante said. His voice was steady. No performance, in it just the even weight of someone who has decided that what is required is clarity rather than command. What you are about to hear is the complete account, every part of it. I am telling you this in advance, so that you understand that nothing in what follows has been edited for my benefit. The room was completely silent. He looked at Seraphina. She opened the folder. The presentation took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Giordano walked the assembly through the financial architecture of Victor's parallel operation, the 11-year construction of diversion channels beneath the Moretti legitimate business structure, the estimated total of funds displaced, the routing mechanisms, the recovery pathways. Now that the authentication sequences retrieved from Marco had provided access to the upper tier of the transfer network, the recovery number was not complete. It would never be complete, some portion of what Victor had moved over. 11 years had passed through enough intermediary structures to be practically irretrievable. The assembly heard this plainly, without softening, and absorbed it in the way that professionals bad news absorb have been prepared to receive. Not easily, but without the additional damage of surprise. Seraphina presented the documentation. The original letter in Aurelio's handwriting was authenticated by 2 independent examiners who had been retained in advance. The transfer instrument was read in full, every clause, every provision, every legal mechanism that Dante's father had built into it and that had remained dormant for 7 years, waiting for the specific circumstance it had been designed to address. Council elders heard it. They asked questions. Careful, precise questions. The questions of people who are not disputing what they are hearing, but are making sure they understand its complete extent before they commit to the implications. Seraphina answered everyone. Dante answered several. Questions went on for 40 minutes, and at the end of them, the room had a different character than it had. At the beginning, not lighter exactly, but settled. Specific gravity of a space in which truth has been fully presented, and the people present have decided collectively to receive it. Then something happened that Seraphina had not prepared for. Benedetto, the eldest member of the council, 74 years old, who had been present when Aurelio Moretti had first built the legitimate business structure that Victor had spent 11 years undermining, stood up. He was not a man who spoke at length in formal assembly. He was known for the economy of his interventions, brief, precise, carrying the weight of someone whose words had been rationed over decades, and were therefore worth more than ordinary speech. Stood. He looked at Seraphina. I have one question, he said. Not about the documentation, not about the operation. He paused. Why did you not come to this council 9 years ago when you first suspected Salerno? The room went very still. Seraphina looked at Benedetto. She had not prepared an answer to this question, because she had not anticipated it being asked publicly. In her private accounting of the decisions she'd made over 9 years, she had examined this question many times. She had her own answers. She had not expected to give them in the stone hall, with 40 people listening. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Benedetto directly, because 9 years ago, she said I was the wife, not the authority. And I knew that a wife bringing accusations against a 30-year family fixture would be heard as a wife, not as someone with information the council needed. She paused. I needed to be able to prove it so thoroughly that the source of the proof didn't matter, so that what I brought you couldn't be dismissed because of who I was. Benedetto held her gaze for a long moment. That is, he said quietly, a very expensive way to be right. Yes, she said. It was. He sat down. The assembly voted on the immediate measures, Victor's formal expulsion from any connection to the Moretti organization. The initiation of recovery proceedings through the legal channels is now available with the authentication sequences, the restructuring of the Administrative Oversight Board that would govern the legitimate business holdings going forward. Every vote was unanimous. Victor was brought before the council briefly, at the assembly's end. Not for ceremony. For the formal reading of the expulsion instrument, a procedural requirement that meant he had to stand in the stone hall and hear it stated in the presence of the full assembly, rather than receiving it through a document. His legal representative was present. The reading took 4 minutes. Victor stood through it with his hands at his sides and his face in the flat, evacuated expression Dante had seen in the private office 2 nights ago. He did not speak. He did not look at Seraphina. He looked at a point on the far wall and kept his eyes there and let the reading happen around him, and when it was finished, he was escorted from the room. The door he stopped. He turned his head and looked at Dante, only at Dante, not at Seraphina, not at the council, and the look lasted for exactly 2 seconds. It was not a threat. It was not defiance. It was the look of a man completing an inventory of a situation, making a final accounting of what had happened and how, and filing the results in whatever internal system he used to process outcomes. Then he left. Dante watched the door close behind him and felt something he would not have predicted. Nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the complicated grief of losing someone he'd trusted. Just the clean absence of a presence that had been in his professional life for 3 decades and was now simply gone. The way a piece of furniture is gone when you finally remove it from a room, when leaving behind a space that takes time to understand as space rather than as absence. He looked at Seraphina beside him. She was watching the door. Her face carried the specific expression of someone at the end of a very long effort, not the face of someone who has won something, but the face of someone who has finished something and is sitting in the silence that follows the finishing and trying to understand what exactly is supposed to happen next. The assembly cleared over the following hour. Capos conferred in clusters before departing. Council members reviewed procedural documents with Giordano. The stone hall, which had held so much compressed weight for 2 days, gradually lightened as people moved through its doors and out into the morning, which had developed from flat gray into something approaching actual light. Emilio was the last of the capos to leave. He stopped beside Seraphina on his way out. He was 61 years old, and he carried his years in the set of his shoulders, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting to say something for 9 years, and is finally, cautiously, saying it. "If we had known," he said, "what you were carrying, we could—" "I know," she said. He nodded once. He looked at her for another moment. Then he left. She watched him go. Celeste Vane left the estate at 2 in the afternoon. Came downstairs with a single bag. She had arrived with more and was leaving with less, which was appropriate in ways that went beyond the practical. She was dressed plainly, without the red and without the Vesper seal, which had been returned to its case that morning. Her face looked different from the face she'd been wearing for 18 months, not older exactly, stripped of something, the layer that had been performing a character for an extended period. Seraphina was in the entry hall when she came down. Dante was not. They had decided this together, briefly, over the logistics of the morning, that Celeste leaving was something Seraphina should be present for, and Dante should not. Not out of cruelty, out of the recognition that Dante's presence would have required the scene to be about him, and that this particular scene did not need to be about him. Celeste stopped when she saw Seraphina. They looked at each other. There was no hostility between them in this moment, which was perhaps the strangest thing about it. After 18 months and an operation of considerable sophistication and 2 days of the most consequential confrontation, Seraphina could recall in her adult life. The 2 women stood in the Moretti estate's entry hall and looked at each other with an expression that was, on both sides, something closer to recognition than anything else. "I was going to say I'm sorry," Celeste said, "but that seems insufficient," Seraphina said. "Yes." Seraphina looked at her for a moment. "How old are you?" 31. "The same age I was when I married into this family." She paused. "What Victor told you about what would happen when this was over, when the operation was finished and the family was fractured? What did he promise you?" Something moved across Celeste's face, a tightening, the expression of someone who has had plenty of time in a room alone to examine a belief they used to hold and is now discovering what remains of it after examination. "Security," she said. "Resources. A position in whatever he built from the pieces. And you believed him. I believed him for 4 years." She looked at the floor briefly. "Took me about 48 hours inside house to start reconsidering. Seraphina said nothing. You're not what I was told you were, Celeste said. I want you to know that. I know that. I don't know if it matters, but I know it. It matters in the way that truth always matters, Seraphina said, which is not always in ways that are immediately useful. Celeste picked up her bag. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped, her back to Seraphina, her hand on the doorframe. The message I sent him. In the corridor, I knew what I was doing. Yes, Seraphina said. He came back anyway. Yes. Pause. That must mean something. It does, Seraphina said. It means I married a man who is capable of making the right choice when everything is stripped away. It just took a great deal of stripping. Celeste opened the door and walked out into the afternoon. Seraphina stood in the entry hall and listened to the sound of a car door closing and an engine starting and tires on the wet courtyard stone moving toward the gate, and she held all of it very still inside herself until the sound was gone. Marco was handled separately, over 2 days of structured interviews with Giordano and the council's legal representative. He gave them everything. The full account, Victor's approach 3 years ago, the nature of the debt used as leverage, every instruction received and executed, every piece of information passed. He gave it without the legal maneuvering of a person trying to minimize consequences. He gave it like a young man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally, with some mixture of relief and shame, set it down. The debt was real. Victor had used a genuine vulnerability and had cultivated it carefully, the way he cultivated everything. Marco had not been evil. He had been young and financially desperate and poorly equipped to identify what he was agreeing to until it was already operational and he was already inside it. None of this erased what he'd done. He understood that. What the council decided, after consideration, was that Marco's cooperation and the authenticity of the information he'd provided had material value to the recovery effort, and that the recovery of the estate's operational integrity was the primary objective. He was released from the organization's service. He was not prosecuted. He was given enough to relocate and told clearly that what happened next was entirely dependent on what he chose to do with the second chance he had been given, which was more than some people in his position received and considerably less than he might have had if the night had gone differently. Dante delivered this to him, personally. He sat across from Marco in the room, in the east wing where the young man had spent 2 days answering questions. And he looked at him and said, "You told me the truth in the corridor when I asked you to stop performing. That's what this is based on. Not forgiveness, not erasure. One honest moment." Marco nodded. He looked like he was going to say something. Then he didn't. He picked up his bag and left. 3 weeks after the assemblies, the estate returned to something that resembled ordinary function. Not the function it had before. Nothing was simply restored to its previous configuration, because the previous configuration had contained the conditions that allowed Victor's operation to exist for 11 years. What emerged was different. A restructured oversight board for the legitimate business holdings, with Seraphina as its formal chair, the first time her role in the family's actual operations had been acknowledged in any official capacity. Giordano brought out of the shadows and given a title that approximated what he actually did. A revised security protocol that eliminated the blind spots Victor's people had used to position physical teams outside the perimeter undetected. The illegitimate operations, the underground network that had been the foundation of the Moretti power for 3 generations were not dissolved. Seraphina was not naive about what the family was, or what it had built itself upon. They were examined with the same rigorous scrutiny as the legitimate holdings, and 3 structures within them that Victor had compromised were dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The work took months. Seraphina was present for all of it, not in the background, not in the space adjacent to the space where decisions were made. At the table, with the documentation and the questions, and the weight of the decisions, and all the imperfect, costly, irreplaceable experience of 9 years of watching how things actually worked underneath the surface of how they were supposed to work. Dante was present beside her, not above her, not in front of her. Spatial arrangement of the morning of the assembly had become, over the following weeks, the spatial arrangement of the family's actual governance. 2 people at the same table, neither one positioned as the background to the other's foreground, making decisions in the full knowledge of what each of them brought and what each of them lacked. It was not comfortable in the early weeks. There was too much history to move through, too many things that had been said and not said over too many years for the reconfiguration to happen quickly or cleanly. There were evenings when they sat across from each other, and the distance between them felt larger than the table's physical width, the specific distance of two people who have learned too much about each other in too short a time and are still integrating the full complexity of what they know. But there were also evenings that were different from that. Quieter evenings when the work was done and the estate was settled, and they sat in the same room without the armor of roles or strategy. And in those evenings, something that had been compressed for years slowly began, in increments too small to measure individually, to find more room. On an evening in late November, Seraphina went to the stone hall. She went alone, in the early dark before dinner, when the hall was empty and the sconces were lit low, and the room had the quality it had, when no one was performing anything inside it, just a room, stone and old timber, and the residue of every formal gathering that had happened inside it across 63 years. The vesper seal was in its glass case on the ceremonial table. She stood in front of the case and looked at it. The black gold surface, the Virelli Crest, the small seam in the interior rim, still there, Giordano's modification, waiting in permanent readiness for a use that it would hopefully never again be needed for. She had not touched the seal since the morning after the assembly, when she had placed back in its case with both hands and closed the glass lid with the deliberate finality of someone, completing a gesture that had been a long time arriving. She didn't touch it now. She stood there for a few minutes in the quiet hall, looking at the object that had been, in the minds of everyone inside and outside this family, for 63 years, the physical embodiment of Moretti authority, thing people bowed to and feared and competed for and were manipulated through and lost themselves trying to hold. Piece of metal, beautiful, old, loaded with meaning that human beings had spent decades depositing into it. Not the thing itself, never the thing itself. She heard footsteps in the corridor, Dante's footsteps, which she had known by sound for 22 years and could identify without looking, and she waited. He came into the doorway of the stone hall and stopped when he saw her at the case. He looked at her, then at the seal. He crossed the room and stood beside her. They stood together in front of the glass case and the old seal inside it, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the quiet between them was not the loaded silence of 2 days of crisis, or the careful silence of two people managing what they showed each other. It was the other kind of quiet, kind that exists between people who have been through something together that can't be undone or fully explained, and who have arrived, imperfectly and at considerable cost, at a version of being in the same room that is simply quietly, without announcement, more honest than what came before. After a while, Dante said, "Do you want it?" She looked at the seal. "No." "Good," he said. "It's not the point. It never was." He was quiet for a moment. "My father knew that." "Yes," she said. "He did." Another silence. Outside, the November dark had settled completely over the estate, and the security lights along the perimeter fence were on. And somewhere in the east wing, a window showed a rectangle of warm light, where Giordano was finishing the day's last reports in his new office, no longer a basement, no longer hidden, just a room where a man did necessary work in the open. "I want to tell you something," Dante said. She waited. "What I did in this room, 3 weeks ago." He kept his eyes on the seal. "I've thought about it every day since. About what it cost you to stand there and not react the way someone had the right to react. About what it took, what kind of person it took, to have spent 9 years building protection around someone who was in the process of humiliating you in front of an assembly, and to just look at the elders and say what you said and walk out." He said nothing. "I don't know how to become the kind of man who deserves that," he said. "I'm not sure I can, but I want you to know that I understand for the first time, clearly, what you have been doing in this house for 19 years. Not the mechanics of it, not the operational architecture, what it actually was." He paused. "And I'm asking you not to forgive me. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking if you will let me be someone who is trying to be different. Not better in some abstract sense. Just trying. Honestly." She turned and looked at him. She looked at his face, the tired face, the gray at the jaw, the eyes that had been stripped over 3 weeks of everything these used to hide behind, and were now, standing in the low light of the stone hall, simply the eyes of a man of 54 who has arrived at a truth about himself, too late to undo the years that preceded it, but not too late to change the years that follow. You already are, she said. He looked at her. The corridor, she said. You walked back. That was not nothing, Dante. That was everything. Something in his face moved, not breaking, not dissolving, but the specific movement of a long-held thing, finally given permission to shift. He didn't say anything. He looked at the seal in its case for a moment, and then he looked at his wife, and then he looked away toward the window. And his jaw worked briefly with something he either couldn't find the words for or had decided didn't need to be said. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Not dramatically, just placed it there, lightly. The way you touch something solid when you need the reality of its presence confirmed. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a while, in the old stone hall where every formal thing this family had ever done had happened, looking at the seal in its case in the low light, not speaking, not performing anything for anyone. The following morning, Seraphina walked through the stone hall on her way to the restructured oversight first formal meeting. She didn't stop at the Vesper seal's case. She walked past it without breaking stride, her folder in her hand, her mind already on the meeting ahead. The questions she'd prepared, 3 items on the agenda that required her to have both the operational data and the relational intelligence of 19 inmates of 19 years in the same room simultaneously. Behind her, the stone hall was quiet. The seal sat in its glass case, untouched. When the oversight board convened in the West Side conference room 20 minutes later, the family's 12 capos and 7 council members took their seats. Seraphina set her folder on the table and looked at the room. Every person in it rose, not because they had been told to, not because of any relic in a glass case in a room down the corridor, not because of a ceremony or a transfer or a public declaration made in front of witnesses, because they knew, they had always known. They simply finally were no longer pretending otherwise. Seraphina looked at the room for one moment, just one, and then she sat down, opened her folder, and began.